family. They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when that same blood tries to drown you? 15 years ago, my family disowned me, called me a failure, a disgrace who would never amount to anything. Tonight at my sister's perfect wedding, my mother looked me in the eye and sneered, "The kitchen seat suits you better, Elena. You understand." I smiled and took my place among the catering staff because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's letting them discover who you've become. That's when it happened. Something dropped from my purse with a soft clink. Before I could reach for it, an 8-year-old boy picked up the gleaming badge and read aloud in his innocent voice, "Excuse me, lady, are you really the CEO who owns Uncle David's daddy's company?" The entire wedding party turned to stare. My brother-in-law David's face drained of color. My mother's champagne glass slipped from her trembling hand. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and this is the story of how I went from the family black sheep sitting in the kitchen to owning everything they thought they'd taken from me. What happens when the daughter they threw away becomes the woman who holds their fate in her hands? Stay with me because what comes next will change everything. They thought they knew about power family and the price of underestimating the wrong person. My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm 45 years old, CEO and founder of Phoenix Financial Solutions, and I live in a glass penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle. I built my empire from nothing, helping women navigate financial independence after life's greatest upheavals. What I couldn't navigate, however, was the envelope that arrived on that gray Tuesday morning bearing my childhood address in handwriting I hadn't seen in 15 years. The invitation was elegant cream-colored paper with gold embossing that probably cost more per piece than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Sarah Elizabeth Rodriguez and David Michael Miller request the honor of your presence. The words blurred together as my hands found their old familiar tremor, the same one that used to overtake me during family dinners when the conversation inevitably turned to my shortcomings. I set the invitation down on my marble kitchen counter and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that frame the city below. How had they even found me? I had changed my name professionally, moved across the country, built a life so far removed from the Rodriguez family that I sometimes forgot that version of myself ever existed. Yet here was proof that I had never truly escaped. The return address was the same house in Sacramento where I'd grown up, where family gatherings meant performance reviews, and love came with conditions I could never quite meet. I picked up the invitation again, studying Sarah's engagement photo. My sister looked exactly the same, perfectly polished blonde hair, that practiced smile that had charmed teachers and boyfriends, and eventually our parents into believing she was the daughter worth keeping. I remembered the last family Christmas I'd attended at 22. I had just started my first real job at a small financial consulting firm, proud to finally have something to contribute to the dinner conversation. But when I'd excitedly shared news of a promotion, my mother had simply said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to Sarah to gush about her acceptance to medical school. The pattern was always the same. My achievements were footnotes to Sarah's headlines. The worst part wasn't the comparison, though, that stung plenty. It was the way they looked through me as if I were made of glass. When I spoke, conversations continued around me. When I needed support during my father's gambling debts crisis at 18, they turned to Sarah for mature advice. When I finally confronted them about the missing money from grandmother's charity fund, they had looked at me like I was the problem, not the solution. I remembered packing that single suitcase, the sound of the front door closing behind me, for what I thought would be the last time. No one had tried to stop me. No one had called. For 15 years, the silence had been complete, which made this invitation feel surreal, almost cruel. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant about the afternoon board meeting. I glanced at the message, then back at the invitation. The woman who had built a multi-million-dollar company and employed 47 people shouldn't be intimidated by a piece of paper. Yet here I was, transported back to feeling like that invisible daughter who could never measure up. The invitation included a small note card in Sarah's handwriting. It would mean everything to have family there. I know it's been too long. No acknowledgement of why it had been too long. No mention of the years of silence, or the reasons I had left in the first place. Just a simple request wrapped in the assumption that time had healed wounds that had never been properly addressed. I walked to my home office where awards and recognition plaques lined the walls. Forbes had called me one of the most influential women in finance. The mayor had given me a key to the city for my work with women's financial literacy programs. I had created something meaningful from nothing, exactly what my family had always insisted I couldn't do. But standing in that room full of achievements holding my sister's wedding invitation, I felt that familiar hollow space in my chest where family approval used to live. I had convinced myself I didn't need it anymore, had built a life rich with success and purpose. So why did this simple piece of paper have the power to make my hands shake? The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons to decline. I had a company to run, commitments to honor a life that didn't include people who had made their feelings about me perfectly clear. But another part, a part I thought I had buried years ago, whispered dangerous possibilities. Maybe they had changed. Maybe this was an olive branch. Maybe finally I could show them who I had become. I set the invitation on my desk and picked up the RSVP card, my finger tracing the elegant script that asked for a simple yes or no response. Such a small decision with the weight of 15 years behind it. As I stared at the card, considering my options, my fingers began to tremble, not from sadness, but from something far more dangerous. Sarah Elizabeth Rodriguez had always been the golden daughter, and looking at her engagement photo, now I could see why our parents had never questioned their choice. At 47, she was everything they had dreamed of in a child. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez Miller, as she would soon be known, had followed the path our mother had mapped out, from birth valedictorian pre-med at Stanford residency at Johns Hopkins, and now a successful cardiologist at one of Sacramento's most prestigious hospitals. She had married Dr. David Miller, a renowned neurosurgeon whose family name carried weight in both medical and social circles. Together, they were the power couple our parents paraded at dinner parties, the success story they told anyone who would listen. I remembered the day Sarah got into medical school. Our mother had called everyone in her contact list, practically vibrating with pride, as she announced that her eldest daughter would be Dr. Rodriguez within a few years. The celebration lasted weeks. There were flowers, congratulatory dinners, and endless phone calls from relatives praising my parents for raising such an accomplished young woman. I was 20 then, working 2 jobs while trying to figure out my own path. But that day, I became invisible in our house. Every conversation revolved around Sarah's future, her potential, her bright tomorrow. When I had tried to share my own news that week about landing an internship at a startup, my mother had patted my head absently and said, "That's nice, dear. Did I tell you Sarah's professors think she has real surgical potential?" It was always like that. My achievements were background noise to Sarah's symphony of success. The comparisons had started early and never stopped. When Sarah brought home straight A's, my B+ report cards were met with pursed lips and disappointed sighs. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. When Sarah volunteered at the hospital and joined the debate team, my interest in art and writing was dismissed as impractical dreaming. When Sarah dated the quarterback who went on to become a lawyer, my relationships were scrutinized for their serious potential and usually found lacking. But it wasn't just academic achievement that set us apart. Sarah had mastered the art of being exactly what our parents expected. She dressed conservatively, spoke softly, never challenged authority, and always made decisions that reflected well on the family name. She was the daughter who could be trusted to maintain appearances, to marry well, to continue the family legacy of respectability that our immigrant grandparents had worked so hard to establish. I, on the other hand, had always been the question mark in our family equation. While Sarah pursued the security of traditional success, I was drawn to the unknown territories of entrepreneurship and innovation. I wanted to build something from nothing, to take risks that scared our parents senseless. When I chose business over medicine, when I talked about starting my own company, instead of joining an established firm, when I moved across the country to chase opportunities that existed only in my imagination, I became the cautionary tale our mother shared with other parents. Don't let your children get too independent too young. Sarah has always known what she wanted, our mother would say to family friends, her voice heavy with implication. Elena, well, she's still trying to find herself. The way she said it made my choices sound like a character flaw, as if my willingness to forge my own path was evidence of some fundamental instability. Sarah was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who would never embarrass the family or make decisions that kept our parents awake at night. The irony was that my unconventional choices had led me to success beyond anything our family had imagined possible. While Sarah had followed a well-worn path to a comfortable upper-middle-class life, I had created something entirely new. My company had revolutionized financial planning for women, had been featured in national magazines, had changed thousands of lives. But because my success didn't fit the mold our parents understood, it somehow counted less in their eyes. I remembered the last time I had tried to explain my work to our mother. I had just closed a major deal and was excited to share the news. We're expanding to 5 new markets, I had told her over the phone. We're going to be able to help women in smaller communities access financial planning services for the first time. Her response had been, "That's wonderful, dear. Sarah just got promoted to chief resident. Isn't that exciting?" Even my victories were stepping stones to conversations about Sarah. The wedding invitation in my hands represented everything Sarah had achieved through conventional excellence. The venue was undoubtedly expensive, the guest list carefully curated to reflect the right social connections, the entire event designed to showcase the perfect life she had built, brick by brick, through meeting every expectation ever placed on her shoulders. Looking at her photo, I could see the same composed smile that had graced our family Christmas cards for decades. Sarah had perfected that expression in childhood, the one that conveyed contentment, success, and absolute certainty about her place in the world. It was the smile of someone who had never had to wonder if she was enough, who had never questioned whether she belonged at the table where decisions about her life were made. But as I studied that flawless engagement portrait, something nagged at me. Perhaps it was the slight tightness around Sarah's eyes, or the way David's hand seemed to grip her waist just a little too possessively, or maybe it was simply my own cynicism, born from years of feeling like the family failure. Whatever it was, I found myself wondering what existed beneath that perfect surface my parents had always admired so much. And yet they never knew what their golden daughter had been doing behind those perfect closed doors. But there were secrets behind Sarah's perfect facade that our parents never suspected, just as there were truths about my own exile that they had buried so deep, even they might have convinced themselves of their own version of events. The real reason I left wasn't because I was the rebellious daughter who couldn't follow rules. It wasn't because I chose the wrong career path or disappointed them one too many times. The real reason I was cast out of the Rodriguez family was because I discovered something that could have destroyed everything they had worked to build. I was 18 then, home for winter break during my freshman year at community college. Sarah was already in her second year of pre-med at Stanford, the pride and joy who called home every Sunday to update our parents on her latest achievements. I was the afterthought daughter attending local school on a partial scholarship, working nights at a diner to pay for books and expenses that our parents claimed we couldn't afford. That December evening, I had come home early from my shift to find our father's study door ajar, which was unusual since he kept it locked whenever he wasn't inside. The light was on and I could hear him speaking in hushed, frantic tones to someone on the phone. Something about his voice made me pause instead of walking past to my room. "I know it's from the building fund," he was saying, his voice strained with panic. "But it's only temporary. The stock will recover, and I'll put it all back before anyone notices." There was a long pause then. $50,000 should cover what I owe to Martinelli. If I don't pay him by Friday, he's going to break my legs. My blood went cold. Our father had always been the pillar of respectability in our community, serving on the church board, managing the construction fund for the new parish hall. He was the man other families looked up to, the successful businessman who had given his daughters opportunities he never had. But standing in that hallway listening to him negotiate the theft of church money to pay gambling debts, I felt my entire understanding of our family crumble. I crept closer to the door and saw him hunched over ledger books, calculator in hand, manipulating numbers with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. Bank statements were spread across his desk, showing transactions that made no sense for a man who preached about living within our means. The church's account information was there too, along with forged signatures that looked remarkably like Father Martinez's handwriting. The next morning I confronted him in his study. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me, but my voice was steady when I said, "I know about the church money, Dad. I heard your phone call last night." His face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, anger, and finally a cold calculation that I had never seen before. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sat back in his chair and studied me like I was a problem to be solved. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said finally. "The business has been struggling since the recession. I made some investments that didn't pan out. I was trying to recover the money before anyone got hurt." "But it's not your money," I said. "It's for the new parish hall. Families have been saving for years to contribute to that fund. Mrs. Garcia works 3 jobs to donate $50 a month. And she'll get her parish hall," he snapped. "Once my investments recover, I'll put every penny back. But I need time, and I need you to keep your mouth shut about things you don't understand." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the man who had lectured me about integrity, who had made me return a candy bar I'd accidentally walked out of a store with when I was 7. "Dad, you have to return the money and tell Father Martinez what happened. Maybe the church can work something out." "Absolutely not." His voice turned ice cold. "Do you have any idea what this would do to our family's reputation? Sarah's future depends on our standing in this community. You want to destroy your sister's chances at medical school because you can't mind your own business." The conversation escalated quickly after that. I told him I couldn't be part of covering up theft, that I would give him 1 week to come clean before I went to Father Martinez myself. That's when he called for our mother and Sarah to join us in the study for what he called a family emergency. What followed was the most surreal hour of my life. My father spun a story about my increasingly erratic behavior and concerning threats against the family. He painted me as a troubled young woman who was jealous of Sarah's success and looking for ways to damage our family's reputation. My mother and Sarah listened with growing alarm as he described fictional incidents of me making wild accusations and threatening to spread lies about our family finances. "She's not stable," he told them, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. "She's talking about making up stories about me stealing from the church." Can you imagine if people heard such lies? I tried to defend myself, tried to explain what I had actually discovered, but every word I spoke was twisted into evidence of my supposed instability. When I mentioned the phone call I'd overheard, my father sadly shook his head and said I was making up conversations that never happened. When I tried to show them the ledger books, they had mysteriously disappeared from his desk. My mother looked at me with genuine fear in her eyes. "Elena, honey, you've been under so much stress with school and work. Maybe you need help. This family has sacrificed everything for both of you girls," Sarah added, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could you even think such horrible things about Dad?" The intervention continued for hours. They presented me with 2 choices: I could voluntarily commit myself for psychiatric evaluation, which would allow them to control the narrative about my breakdown, or I could leave the house immediately and never speak to any of them again. If I chose the second option, they would cut all financial support and tell everyone that I had abandoned the family for reasons they preferred not to discuss. It was masterfully done. They had turned my discovery of actual criminal behavior into evidence of my mental instability, and they were giving me a choice between institutionalization or exile. There was no option for truth, no possibility of justice, no path forward that didn't require me to either sacrifice my sanity or my family. I packed my single suitcase that night, taking only what I could carry. As I stood at the front door with my belongings, my father handed me $500 in cash and a bus ticket to Seattle. "This is for the best," he said, not meeting my eyes, meeting my. "You'll be better off starting fresh somewhere new." I left to protect them from the scandal that would have destroyed Sarah's future and our family's reputation. But they painted me as the villain who abandoned family. Seattle greeted me with rain and the harsh reality of what $500 could buy in a city where I knew absolutely no one. The bus had dropped me off at a station that smelled of diesel fuel and broken dreams, and I spent my first night there because I couldn't afford even the cheapest motel room I could find. The next morning, I used $40 of my remaining money to put a deposit down on a 15-square-meter room in a building where the hallways reeked of cigarettes and the walls were so thin I could hear every argument, every sob, every moment of my neighbors' struggles. My room was barely larger than my childhood bedroom's walk-in closet. It contained a twin bed with a mattress that sagged in the middle, a card table that served as both desk and dining room, and a hot plate that worked sporadically. The single window looked out onto an alley where garbage trucks made their rounds at 4 a.m, which became my inadvertent alarm clock for the next 3 years. Survival required a schedule that would have killed the 18-year-old girl who had once complained about getting up for 10 o'clock classes. I worked the breakfast and lunch shift at Mel's Diner 6 days a week, serving coffee and hash browns to construction workers and office employees who barely looked up from their phones when ordering. The work was physically demanding and the tips were unpredictable, but it provided just enough income to cover rent and basic groceries if I was careful. Evenings belonged to Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm where I cleaned offices from 6 p.m. to midnight. I learned to navigate corporate buildings with my cart of supplies, emptying wastebaskets and vacuuming around the remnants of business meetings I would never be invited to attend. The work was solitary, which suited me fine, and it paid better than the diner. More importantly, it gave me access to computers after hours where I could learn software programs and develop skills that had nothing to do with cleaning toilets and replacing printer paper. Weekends were reserved for whatever freelance graphic design work I could find. I had taught myself Photoshop and Illustrator using library computers during my community college days, and now those skills became a lifeline. I designed flyers for local bands, created business cards for small restaurants, and built basic websites for anyone willing to pay $50 for services that established agencies charged 10 times more for. The work was inconsistent, but every completed project felt like a small victory against the circumstances that had landed me in that tiny room. The necessity of surviving on such a tight budget forced me to become obsessive about tracking every penny. I kept detailed spreadsheets of income and expenses, noting patterns in my spending and identifying areas where I could save even a few dollars. I learned which grocery stores had the best prices, on which days how to meal prep to avoid food waste, and exactly how much I could afford to spend on transportation versus walking to save money for other necessities. It was during those long months of financial tightrope walking that I began to notice something. Nearly every woman I encountered seemed to be struggling with similar challenges, but none of them had a systematic approach to managing their money. The single mother at the laundromat didn't know that switching to generic detergent could save her $60 a year. The college student who cleaned offices with me had no idea that she was paying twice as much as necessary for her cell phone plan. The waitresses at Mel's were constantly surprised by bills they should have anticipated. I started helping them informally, sharing the budgeting techniques I had developed out of necessity. Word spread, and soon I was spending my lunch breaks creating simple financial plans for women who had never had anyone teach them how to make their money stretch. I realized that there was a gap in the market for accessible financial planning tools designed specifically for women who were managing tight budgets without family safety nets. The idea for an app began forming during those conversations. It wouldn't be another complex financial management system designed for people who already had significant assets to manage. Instead, it would be intuitive software that could help women track expenses, identify saving opportunities, and build emergency funds even when they were living paycheck to paycheck. It would include features like bill reminders, grocery budget calculators, and goal-setting tools that acknowledge the reality of living on irregular income. I spent months developing the concept during stolen hours between jobs, sketching interfaces on napkins, during diner breaks, and writing code late into the night after finishing my cleaning routes. The app would be called Phoenix, both for the city where I had landed and for what it represented about rising from difficult circumstances. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening while I was emptying the trash in the office of James Chen, a commercial real estate developer who often worked late. He was there that night reviewing contracts, and we struck up a conversation about the building's history. I mentioned that I was working on a financial planning app for women expecting polite disinterest, but instead he asked detailed questions about the target market and revenue model. "You know," he said after I had explained the basic concept, "my daughter just went through a messy divorce. She's a teacher, never really learned to manage money on her own. Something like this could have helped her tremendously." 3 days later, he asked me to meet him for coffee before my shift at the diner. He had done research on similar apps, had spoken to his accountant about the market potential, and had reached a conclusion that changed my life. "I want to invest $10,000 in your app," he said simply. "I think you're on to something, and I believe in your work ethic." I nearly choked on my coffee. $10,000 was more money than I had seen in one place since leaving home. It was enough to quit one of my jobs and focus seriously on app development. It was the difference between dreaming about Phoenix and actually building it. As I walked home that evening with his check in my pocket, I thought about calling someone to share the incredible news. But there was no one to call. My family had written me off as a failure, and I had been too busy surviving to build close friendships. This moment of triumph belonged entirely to me. What I never told anyone about my first investor was that James Chen had been my estranged father's biggest rival. James Chen's investment transformed everything, but not in the way I had initially imagined. The $10,000 didn't just buy me freedom from one of my 3 jobs. It bought me the credibility to dream bigger than a simple budgeting app. Within 6 months of receiving his funding, I had developed Phoenix into a comprehensive financial planning platform. But more importantly, I had discovered that my real talent wasn't just in creating software, it was in understanding the specific financial challenges that women faced when they had no safety net. The app launched quietly in January, but by March, word of mouth had begun to spread through networks I hadn't even known existed. Women were recommending Phoenix to their divorced friends, their sisters starting over after breakups, their co-workers who were struggling to make ends meet on single incomes. The user base grew organically, driven by genuine need rather than marketing campaigns I couldn't afford. By summer, I realized I needed help. The customer service emails alone were overwhelming, and women were requesting features I hadn't anticipated. That's when I made one of the best decisions of my early career. Instead of hiring experienced professionals I couldn't afford, I recruited women who understood the problem Phoenix was trying to solve because they had lived it themselves. My first employee was Maria Santos, a recently divorced mother of 2 who had been working 3 part-time jobs while trying to navigate the financial aftermath of her marriage ending. She had discovered Phoenix during her own crisis and had sent me detailed suggestions for improvements. When I offered her a full-time position as customer success manager, she cried on the phone. Not because of the salary, which was modest, but because someone finally valued her insights about financial recovery. Next came Jennifer Kim, a marketing professional who had been laid off at 45 and was struggling to rebuild her career while supporting aging parents. She understood the unique challenges of women who were restarting their professional lives later than society expected, and she became our head of user experience. Then there was Rachel Washington, a financial advisor who had grown frustrated with traditional firms that dismissed women clients with smaller portfolios. And finally, Lisa Chen James's daughter, who joined us as operations manager after her divorce was finalized. Within 8 months of incorporating Phoenix Financial Solutions, we had grown from my kitchen table operation to a legitimate company with 5 employees, a small office in Capitol Hill, and a user base that was expanding faster than we could have projected. The app had been downloaded over 100,000 times, and our customer retention rate was unprecedented in the financial software space. What made Phoenix different wasn't just the technology, though our user interface was intuitive in ways that traditional financial planning software wasn't. What set us apart was that we understood our users' lives. We knew that single mothers couldn't always make regular monthly contributions to savings accounts, so we designed features that accommodated irregular income. We understood that women often had to rebuild their financial lives from scratch, so we created educational content that didn't assume prior knowledge or stable employment history. The success caught the attention of local media. First, it was a small piece in the Seattle Times about innovative startups founded by women. Then came an invitation to speak at a conference about financial technology. By the time Forbes Local reached out about featuring me in their 30 Under 30 Rising Stars section, I had stopped being surprised by opportunities that once seemed impossible. The Forbes interview was conducted over coffee near my office, and the journalist was genuinely interested in the story of Phoenix's founding. I told her about identifying an underserved market, about building a team of women who understood the challenges firsthand, about creating technology that acknowledged the reality of women's financial lives. What I didn't tell her was that I had learned about financial survival by living on $500 in a city where I knew no one, or that I had been disowned by my family for discovering their secrets. When the article was published accompanied by a professional headshot that made me look like someone who had always been destined for success, I held the magazine in my hands for a long time. The woman in that photo was confident, accomplished, surrounded by the trappings of professional achievement. She bore little resemblance to the 18-year-old who had arrived in Seattle with nothing but bus fare and determination. The success of Phoenix had allowed me to move out of that tiny room and into a real apartment, then eventually into a small house in Fremont with a yard and space for a home office. I could afford to eat at restaurants without calculating the cost down to the penny. I could buy clothes that weren't from thrift stores. For the first time in my adult life, I had financial security that wasn't dependent on working 3 jobs simultaneously. But success, I discovered, had its own kind of loneliness. On the evening the Forbes article was published, I sat in my new living room surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built, and realized I had no one to call with the news. My employees were colleagues, not close friends. James Chen had become a mentor and business advisor, but our relationship remained professional. The women who used Phoenix sent grateful emails, but they knew Elena Rodriguez, the CEO, not Elena Rodriguez, the person. I thought about my family that night, wondering if they ever imagined what had become of the daughter they had cast out. Did they know that the same determination that had led me to confront my father's theft had also led me to build something meaningful from nothing? Did they ever wonder whether I had survived? Or had they convinced themselves that forgetting me was easier than facing what they had done? The irony wasn't lost on me that I had built a company dedicated to helping women who had been abandoned by the financial systems they had trusted, while I myself had been abandoned by the family system I had trusted. Phoenix existed because I understood what it felt like to have no backup plan, no safety net, no one to catch you when everything fell apart. Looking at the Forbes magazine lying on my coffee table, I realized that my success had traveled further than I knew. Local publications often got picked up by wire services, shared on social media, redistributed to regional papers across the country. And still her name made it into their living room newspaper without them ever knowing it was their disowned daughter. The truth was, I had known about David Michael Miller long before that wedding invitation arrived at my door. 6 months earlier, his name had appeared on a list of senior management personnel at Hartwell & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm that Phoenix Financial Solutions was considering for acquisition. Our expansion into traditional financial consulting required established client relationships and experienced staff, and Hartwell fit our criteria perfectly. What I hadn't expected was to find the name David Miller on their employee roster, complete with a photograph that made my blood run cold. David Miller. The same David who had made my sophomore year at community college a living hell. The same David who had systematically destroyed my self-confidence, isolated me from friends, and left me emotionally shattered when I was 19 years old. The same David who was now, according to his LinkedIn profile, engaged to my sister Sarah and working at a company I was about to purchase. The acquisition had been moving forward smoothly until I saw his face in those employee files. Suddenly, what had been a straightforward business decision became something much more personal. I spent weeks researching his background, his career trajectory, his financial situation. David had bounced between several firms over the past decade, leaving each position under circumstances that weren't quite scandalous enough to destroy his reputation, but were concerning enough to make me wonder what my due diligence team might uncover. When the wedding invitation arrived, I understood that the universe was offering me an opportunity I couldn't have orchestrated better myself. David thought he was marrying into the respectable Rodriguez family building connections that would secure his future. He had no idea that the black sheep daughter he had tormented years ago was now the CEO who would soon control his professional fate. The decision to attend wasn't made in a moment of emotional weakness or nostalgic hope for reconciliation. It was a calculated business move disguised as family obligation. I wanted to see David's face when he realized who I had become. I wanted to observe the family dynamics that had cast me out to understand whether they had genuinely convinced themselves that I was the problem, or if they sometimes wondered about the daughter they had sacrificed to protect their secrets. My preparations began immediately. I booked the presidential suite at the Fairmont Sacramento's most prestigious hotel for the entire weekend. If I was going to make an appearance in my family's world, it would be on my own terms from a position of undeniable success. The suite cost more than my entire first year's rent in Seattle, but the symbolism was worth every penny. The outfit required careful consideration. It needed to command respect without appearing ostentatious to signal success, without seeming like I was trying too hard. I flew to New York and spent an afternoon at Bergdorf Goodman working with a personal stylist to select a midnight blue suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The cut was perfect, the fabric was exquisite, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who could walk into any boardroom in the world and be taken seriously. My stylist Marcus understood the assignment without my having to explain the subtext. "You want to look like money," he said, adjusting the jacket's shoulders. "Old money, quiet power, the kind of success that doesn't need to announce itself." He was exactly right. This wasn't about showing off. It was about demonstrating that I had transcended their world entirely. I scheduled appointments with Sacramento's top salon for hair and makeup booking services for the morning of the wedding. My plan was to arrive looking like I had stepped off the cover of Fortune magazine, every detail perfectly calibrated to communicate that Elena Rodriguez was no longer the desperate teenager they had driven away. The most crucial decision was timing. I could have called ahead, could have given them warning that I would be attending. A normal person, someone seeking reconciliation, would have reached out to confirm arrangements to smooth the way for an awkward reunion. But I wasn't interested in making this easier for them. I wanted the shock value of my unexpected appearance, wanted to watch their faces when they realized that their family's abandoned daughter had not only survived, but thrived beyond their wildest imagination. I spent hours researching the wedding venue, the guest list, the social circles that would be represented. My mother's Facebook account, which I accessed through a fake profile, provided extensive details about the event's significance in Sacramento's social hierarchy. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a display of the Rodriguez family's standing in their community, a celebration of Sarah's achievement in landing such a prestigious husband. The irony was delicious. They would be celebrating Sarah's marriage to a man whose career I now controlled, whose professional future depended on decisions I would make in the coming months. David thought he was marrying up, gaining access to respectability and social connections. He had no idea that his bride's disgraced sister held his fate in her hands. I practiced my responses to the inevitable questions about my life, my career, my unexpected success. I would be gracious but vague, successful but modest, present but emotionally unavailable. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of dramatic confrontations or emotional breakdowns. Instead, I would be the perfect guest, politely mysterious about my achievements, letting their imaginations fill in the details. The RSVP card remained blank on my desk for weeks as I finalized every aspect of my plan. When I finally filled it out checking yes with a Mont Blanc pen that cost more than my father probably spent on groceries in a month, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with family reunion. This wasn't forgiveness. This was checkmate, and I'd been planning this move for years. The Fairmont Sacramento rose before me like a monument to everything my family had always valued. Old money, elegance, understated luxury. The kind of respectability that came with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. I stepped out of the black town car I had hired for the weekend, my Armani suit catching the late afternoon light as the doorman rushed to take my luggage. The midnight blue fabric moved like liquid silk, and I could feel the weight of the Cartier watch on my wrist, the soft leather of my Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement with each measured step. Walking through the lobby was like making an entrance on a stage I had been rehearsing for months. Conversations paused as I passed heads turned with the kind of automatic attention that expensive clothing and confident posture commanded. I had learned over the years of building Phoenix that presence was something you could cultivate, that the right combination of quality materials and unshakable self-assurance could make people assume you belonged in any room you entered. The concierge desk was my first stop where I intended to confirm the details of my presidential suite reservation and perhaps inquire about the wedding arrangements for the Rodriguez-Miller celebration. The young woman behind the marble counter looked up with the practiced smile of someone trained to recognize wealth and importance. "Good afternoon, I'm Elena Rodriguez," I said, placing my identification and credit card on the counter with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized. "I believe you have a reservation for me." Her fingers flew across her keyboard, and I watched her expression shift from professional courtesy to confusion, then to something that looked uncomfortably like panic. She typed again slower this time, then looked up with an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, but I'm not seeing your reservation in our system. Could you possibly have made it under a different name?" The first flash of suspicion hit me then. I had confirmed this reservation twice, had received confirmation. Emails had even spoken directly with the hotel's VIP services coordinator about special arrangements. My reservation had been solid, documented, guaranteed. "Perhaps you could check again," I said, my voice remaining level despite the growing certainty that something was wrong. "The presidential suite reserved 6 weeks ago under Elena Rodriguez for the Rodriguez-Miller wedding weekend." More typing, more searching, more apologetic smiles. Other guests were beginning to queue behind me, and I could sense their impatience, could feel the weight of their attention as the situation began to unfold into exactly the kind of public embarrassment that someone had likely intended. "I'm finding a record that a reservation was made," the concierge said carefully, "but it appears to have been canceled 3 days ago. I have a notation here that the cancellation came directly from the Rodriguez family booking coordinator." The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. Someone had known I was coming. Someone had access to the wedding planning details, had discovered my reservation, and had taken steps to ensure my arrival would be as uncomfortable as possible. The precision of it was almost admirable in its petty cruelty. "I see," I said, allowing just a hint of ice to enter my voice. "And what accommodations do you have available for this evening?" The concierge's relief was palpable as she shifted into problem-solving mode. "We do have a lovely room in our heritage wing," she said, typing rapidly. "It's not quite the presidential suite, but it's very comfortable, and given the circumstances, I'd be happy to offer it at a reduced rate." The heritage wing, I knew from my research, was the hotel's euphemism for their older, smaller rooms tucked away from the main building. It was where they housed overflow guests, wedding party members who weren't quite important enough for the premium accommodations. It was, in other words, exactly where my family had always believed I belonged. "That will be fine," I said, signing the registration with a Mont Blanc pen that probably cost more than the concierge made in a week. "I assume the Rodriguez-Miller wedding party is being housed in the Tower Suites." "Yes, ma'am," she confirmed, handing me my keycards. "The family has reserved the entire top 2 floors for their guests." Of course they had. Sarah's wedding was being treated with the importance of a state function, complete with luxury accommodations for everyone who mattered. Everyone except the daughter who had been systematically erased from their narrative. As I made my way to the Heritage Wing, wheeling my luggage behind me, I passed the elevators that led to the tower suites. A group of well-dressed women were waiting there, chattering excitedly about tomorrow's ceremony, about how beautiful Sarah looked, about what an impressive match she had made. I recognized a few faces from my childhood, family friends, members of my mother's social circle, women who had watched me grow up before I became inconvenient to acknowledge. None of them recognized me. Why would they? The last time they had seen me, I was an awkward 18-year-old fleeing Sacramento with a single suitcase. The woman standing near them now bore no resemblance to that broken girl. My room in the Heritage Wing was exactly what I had expected, clean, comfortable, and utterly forgettable. The view looked out onto the hotel's service entrance rather than the garden terraces where tomorrow's reception would be held. It was the kind of room you gave to distant relatives who had to be invited but didn't need to be impressed. I hung my suit carefully in the closet and sat on the edge of the bed processing what had just happened. The canceled reservation wasn't random bad luck or clerical error. It was a message, a reminder that even when I came back successful and powerful, I would still be relegated to the margins of my family's world. But they had miscalculated something crucial. The 18-year-old girl they remembered would have been devastated by this kind of public slight, would have retreated in embarrassment, or fought back with emotional outbursts that could be dismissed as evidence of her instability. The woman I had become, however, understood that their petty cruelties were actually valuable intelligence about their state of mind. They were threatened enough by my presence to take preemptive action. They cared enough about controlling my experience to go to considerable trouble to ensure I felt unwelcome. Most importantly, they had revealed their hand before the game had even begun. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the final details of the Hartwell & Associates acquisition. David Miller's employment contract, his performance reviews, his financial dependence on a job he had no idea was about to change ownership. Tomorrow's wedding would be interesting, but the real satisfaction would come in the weeks and months afterward as the consequences of this weekend rippled through their carefully constructed lives. But nothing could have prepared me for what they had planned for the reception seating. The wedding ceremony had been a masterpiece of Sacramento society elegance, held in the hotel's grand ballroom with 300 guests, witnessing Sarah and David exchange vows beneath an arch of white orchids that probably cost more than most people's cars. I had slipped in quietly just as the processional began taking a seat in the very back row where I could observe without drawing attention. From my vantage point, I watched my parents beam with pride as their golden daughter married her neurosurgeon prince, the culmination of everything they had dreamed for their family's legacy. As the ceremony concluded and guests began making their way to the cocktail reception, I followed the crowd toward the ballroom's adjoining spaces. The transition from ceremony to reception was a choreographed dance of social hierarchy, with family members and VIP guests being guided by discreet staff members toward premium seating areas, while others waited to be directed to their designated tables. I approached one of the wedding coordinators, a harried-looking woman in her 30s, clutching a clipboard like a lifeline. Her name tag read Jennifer, and she had the slightly frantic energy of someone managing an event that had to go perfectly or her career would be in jeopardy. "Excuse me," I said, offering my most polished smile. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, the bride's sister. Could you direct me to my table?" Jennifer's face went through a series of micro-expressions that I had learned to recognize in business negotiations: recognition, confusion, panic, and finally forced composure. She flipped through several pages on her clipboard, then looked up with the kind of smile people use when delivering bad news they hope won't cause a scene. "Oh yes, Ms. Rodriguez," she said, her voice artificially bright. "You have a very special seating arrangement. If you'll just follow me, please." The word special, in that context, was never a good sign. Jennifer led me away from the main reception area where round tables adorned with crystal and silver were set for 8 guests each past the dance floor where a jazz quartet was setting up their instruments beyond the bar, where guests were already gathering with champagne flutes catching the light from elaborate chandeliers. We walked through a side door marked Staff Only and into a service corridor that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and commercial kitchen equipment. The glamour of the reception faded behind us, replaced by the utilitarian reality of how elegant events actually functioned. Jennifer's heels clicked nervously on the linoleum floor as she led me deeper into the hotel's working areas. "Here we are," she announced with forced enthusiasm, stopping beside a small round table that had been set up in an alcove between the main kitchen and a storage area. The table was technically in the reception space, separated from the main dining area only by a decorative screen, but it might as well have been in a different building. It was positioned where the catering staff took their breaks, where dirty dishes were wheeled past on their way to the industrial dishwashers, where the constant traffic of servers and busboys created a steady stream of noise and activity. The table was set for one. "This is quite intimate." I observed, my voice maintaining perfect neutrality despite the insult burning in my chest. "Very thoughtful of someone to arrange this." Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "The family thought you might prefer a quieter spot," she said weakly. "Less overwhelming than the main reception area." Before I could respond, I heard the familiar sound of my mother's voice behind me. "Elena, sweetheart, you made it after all." The endearment was delivered with the same tone someone might use to express polite surprise at finding a stray cat on their doorstep. I turned to find my mother approaching in a champagne-colored mother-of-the-bride dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She looked exactly as I remembered her, perhaps a bit more refined around the edges, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon that spoke of expensive salon appointments and careful maintenance of appearances. "Hello, Mother," I said, allowing her to air-kiss both my cheeks in the continental fashion she had always favored for special occasions. "Congratulations on Sarah's wedding. Everything looks beautiful." "Thank you, dear," she replied, her hands briefly touching my shoulders as she stepped back to look at me. I saw her take in the quality of my suit, the unmistakable signs of success that money could buy, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been surprise or possibly calculation. "I hope you don't mind the seating arrangement." She continued, her voice taking on that particular tone of false concern I remembered from childhood. "I thought this spot would be perfect for you. Much more peaceful than the main reception area, and you know how you've always preferred quieter settings. It really suits your personality better, don't you think?" The poison was delivered with such practiced sweetness that someone overhearing might have thought she was being genuinely considerate. But I heard the message underneath: you don't belong with the important guests, your comfort matters less than our image, and we've found a way to include you without actually having to acknowledge your presence. "How thoughtful," I replied, matching her tone perfectly. "You've always been so good at understanding exactly what people need." My mother smiled, apparently satisfied that her message had been received and accepted without fuss. "I should get back to the reception line," she said. "Do enjoy the evening, sweetheart." As she glided away in her expensive dress, I took a moment to study the seating arrangement more closely. A large display board near the main reception entrance showed the elegant calligraphy listing of table assignments for all 300 guests. I walked over to examine it, running my finger down the alphabetical listing of names. Rodriguez family members were well-represented cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends who had known us for decades. Everyone who mattered in my parents' social circle was carefully placed at tables that reflected their importance and relationship to the bride and groom. My name appeared nowhere on that board. Elena Rodriguez simply did not exist in the official record of Sarah's wedding guests. I had been erased so completely from the family narrative that they couldn't even acknowledge my presence with a proper table assignment. I walked back to my solitary table in the service area and sat down in the single chair they had provided, The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally sitting in the kitchen, relegated to the space where the real work happened, while the beautiful people celebrated in the main dining room. She smiled graciously and took her seat, but her heart had turned to ice. I had been sitting at my isolated table for perhaps 20 minutes, watching the elegant choreography of the reception unfold through the decorative screen that separated me from the main celebration when I saw him approaching. The groom himself, still radiant from the ceremony, was making his way through the service area with the confident stride of a man who had just secured everything he had ever wanted. David Michael Miller at 46 was exactly what central casting would order for a successful neurosurgeon. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of distinguished silver threading through his dark hair that made him look mature rather than aging. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and charming, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He was by any objective measure exactly the kind of man my parents would want their daughter to marry. As he drew closer to my secluded corner, I could see something shift in his expression. The confident smile faltered slightly, and his eyes seemed to narrow as if he were trying to bring something into focus. There was a moment of hesitation in his step, a brief pause that suggested recognition, wrestling with disbelief. "Well, hello there," he said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm David Miller, the groom." Something about his voice struck me as familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. There was a particular cadence to his speech, a slight emphasis on certain syllables that tickled the edges of my memory. But 27 years had passed since I was 18, and voices change, faces mature, and memories fade. I had no reason to connect this successful surgeon with anyone from my past. "Elena Rodriguez," I replied, shaking his offered hand, and noting how quickly he released it. "Sarah's sister." "Ah, yes," he said, his smile becoming more forced. "Sarah mentioned she had a sister. From Seattle, isn't it?" Sarah said, "You work in technology?" The way he said technology carried just a hint of dismissal, as if my career was something vaguely distasteful that he was too polite to mention directly. It was the tone of someone who believed that real success came through traditional professions, through institutions he understood and respected. "Something like that." I agreed, studying his face more carefully. There was something about the set of his jaw, the way he held his head slightly tilted when he spoke, that felt hauntingly familiar. But the context was all wrong. This was Sarah's new husband, a respected doctor, a pillar of Sacramento society. Whatever memory was trying to surface didn't fit with the man standing before me. "Well, it's nice to meet you," he said, already starting to back away, as if he had fulfilled his obligation by acknowledging the bride's peculiar sister tucked away in her corner. "I should get back to the reception. Duty calls, you know how it is." "Nice to meet you." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Not the words themselves, but the exact way he pronounced them, with that particular emphasis on nice, that made it sound almost sarcastic. The tone was identical to one I had heard 27 years ago, spoken by a young man who had said those same words under very different circumstances. Suddenly, I was 19 again, standing in the hallway of Sacramento Community College, my backpack heavy with textbooks. I could barely afford my schedule arranged around 3 part-time jobs that kept me fed, but constantly exhausted. I was walking to my economics class when I collided with someone coming around the corner, sending my carefully organized papers flying across the linoleum floor. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," I had said, dropping to my knees to gather my scattered assignments and notes. A pair of expensive sneakers appeared in my field of vision, and I looked up to see a young man about my age watching me scramble to collect my belongings. He was handsome in that effortless way that spoke of privilege and good genetics, dressed in clothes that cost more than I made in a month of waiting tables. "Nice to meet you too," he had said in exactly the same tone David had just used, making it clear that our collision was an inconvenience he had no interest in prolonging. He had stepped over my papers and continued on his way without offering to help, leaving me on my hands and knees in the hallway. That had been our first encounter, though it wouldn't be our last. David Chen, as he had been known then before he changed his surname to Miller, sometime during medical school. David Chen, who had pursued me with the focused intensity of someone who enjoyed the challenge of conquest. David Chen, who had systematically isolated me from my few friends, convinced me that my dreams of transferring to a 4-year university were unrealistic, and made me believe that I was lucky to have his attention at all. David Chen, who had taken me to that party in his off-campus apartment, who had pushed drink after drink into my hands while I tried to study for finals. David Chen, who had ignored my protests, who had dismissed my tears the next morning, who had called me a liar when I tried to talk about what had happened. David Chen, who had spread rumors about my instability when I couldn't hide the pregnancy that resulted from that night, who had convinced everyone we knew that I was making up stories to trap him into a relationship he didn't want. The memory crashed over me in waves, each detail sharp and painful despite the years I had spent trying to bury them. The morning sickness that made it impossible to keep food down during my shifts at the diner. The terrifying realization that I was pregnant and completely alone. The miscarriage that came 3 weeks later, blessing and trauma wrapped together in a way that left me broken in ways I hadn't even understood at 19. I had dropped out of school that semester, unable to face the whispers and stares, unable to sit in classes where David's version of events had preceded me. My academic dreams had crumbled along with my emotional stability, and I had spent the next 2 years rebuilding myself from the ground up before I was strong enough to even think about college again. His voice triggered the memory she'd buried for 20 years, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. David had barely disappeared back into the main reception when I became aware of someone else approaching my secluded table. This time it was an older gentleman, perhaps in his mid-60s, with the kind of distinguished bearing that came from decades of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of people. He was impeccably dressed in a navy suit that whispered of Savile Row tailoring, and he walked with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language but had long since mastered it completely. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I believe we may have a mutual connection through business circles." I looked up from the glass of champagne I had been nursing, curious about what business connection this distinguished stranger might imagine we shared. He had the look of old money and established power, exactly the type of person my parents would cultivate for their social circle, but I was certain I had never seen him before. "I'm Robert Chen," he continued, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I run Chen Industries here in Sacramento. Import and distribution primarily focused on Asian markets. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you're Elena Rodriguez from Phoenix Financial Solutions." The recognition hit me like a spotlight suddenly illuminating a dark stage. Robert Chen was indeed a name I knew, though we had never met in person. Chen Industries was one of the largest privately held companies on the West Coast, with revenues that dwarfed most public corporations. More importantly, Robert Chen had been featured in the same Forbes article that had highlighted my own company, though his profile had been far more extensive than the brief mention Phoenix had received. "Yes, that's right," I said, standing to shake his hand properly. "Though I have to admit I'm surprised you recognized me from such a brief magazine mention." "Brief, perhaps, but memorable," he replied with genuine enthusiasm. "A financial services company founded by a woman specifically designed to serve other women who are rebuilding their lives. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that catches my attention. I've been following Phoenix's growth with great interest since that article was published." His voice had risen slightly with his enthusiasm, and I became aware that our conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby guests who had wandered closer to the service area, perhaps looking for the restrooms, or simply curious about the activity in this less glamorous corner of the reception. "Phoenix Financial has filled a genuine gap in the market," Robert continued, apparently oblivious to the growing audience. "Traditional financial planning services have never understood that women's economic lives follow different patterns than men's. Your company's approach to helping women navigate financial independence after major life transitions is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." A small group of wedding guests had now gathered within earshot, their conversations quieting as they focused on Robert's enthusiastic praise. I could see the wheels turning in their minds as they tried to reconcile what they were hearing with their assumptions about Sarah's wayward sister who had been relegated to the kitchen area. "The growth metrics I've seen reported are impressive," Robert went on clearly in his element when discussing business strategy. "From startup to 8 figures in revenue in less than 5 years. That's the kind of trajectory that makes investors take notice. You've built something truly special with Phoenix Financial." The whispers were starting now, subtle but unmistakable. Did he say 8 figures? Phoenix Financial. Elena Rodriguez. Isn't that Sarah's sister? I could feel the shift in energy as the information spread through the small crowd, as guests who had barely registered my presence began to reassess the woman sitting alone at the kitchen table. "I've actually been hoping to discuss a potential partnership," Robert continued, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket. "Chen Industries has been looking to expand our financial services division, and I believe there might be significant synergies between our companies. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting when you're back in Seattle." Before I could respond, I heard the familiar click of my mother's heels approaching rapidly across the service area's linoleum floor. She appeared at Robert's shoulder with a smile that looked painted on her eyes, darting nervously between us and the growing cluster of interested guests. "Robert," she said with forced brightness, placing her hand on his arm in a gesture that seemed both welcoming and restraining. "How wonderful to see you here. I hope you're enjoying the reception." "Margaret, wonderful to see you as well," Robert replied warmly. "I was just having the most fascinating conversation with your daughter Elena about her remarkable company. You must be incredibly proud of what she's accomplished with Phoenix Financial." My mother's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, but I caught the brief flash of something that looked remarkably like panic. "Oh yes, of course," she said, her voice maintaining its artificial brightness. "Elena has always been so entrepreneurial. But Robert, I've been looking everywhere for you. Judge Morrison has been asking about your thoughts on the new trade legislation, and I promised I'd introduce you to. Would you mind terribly if I stole you away for just a moment?" It was masterfully done, the kind of social maneuvering that could redirect a conversation without appearing rude or abrupt. But there was an urgency in her movements, a tension in her posture that suggested this wasn't casual hostess behavior. She was actively working to end this conversation, to separate Robert from whatever information he might share about my success. Robert looked slightly disappointed but nodded graciously. "Of course I understand completely. Elena, it was a pleasure meeting you in person. I do hope we can continue our conversation soon." As my mother guided him away toward the main reception area, I caught sight of her profile and noticed something that made my blood run cold. Then her mother cuts the conversation short, her face pale with something that looked like fear. The sound of crystal being tapped with silver drew my attention back to the main reception area, where my father had risen from his seat at the head table with a champagne flute in hand. Even from my isolated corner behind the decorative screen, I could see him clearly as he commanded the attention of the 300 guests assembled to celebrate his daughter's perfect marriage. "Friends, family, honored guests." His voice carried easily across the ballroom, amplified by the confidence of a man who had spent decades addressing church congregations and business meetings. "Margaret and I want to thank you all for being here to witness this joyous occasion." He looked every inch the proud father, distinguished in his formal wear, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture straight with the kind of bearing that spoke of success and respectability. This was the man who had built a reputation as a pillar of the community, who served on charity boards and gave speeches about integrity and family values. "We have been blessed," he continued, his voice warming as he looked toward Sarah at the bridal table, "to raise a daughter who has exceeded every dream we ever had. Sarah has brought nothing but pride and joy to our family from the moment she was born." The emphasis on daughter was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew our family history. Not daughters plural, but daughter singular. In his version of our family story, I had been edited out so completely that he could speak of Sarah as if she were an only child without technically lying. She has achieved everything through her own dedication and hard work." My father went on, raising his glass higher. "Medical school, her residency, and now this beautiful marriage to David, who represents everything we could hope for in a son-in-law. Tonight we celebrate not just a wedding, but the continuation of everything our family stands for." The applause was enthusiastic, and I watched as guests raised their glasses to toast Sarah's success. From my vantage point, I could see the main table clearly, could observe the satisfied smiles of my parents as they basked in the admiration of their social circle. But it was my mother who provided the most interesting moment of the evening. As the applause died down and guests began to resume their conversations, she rose unsteadily from her chair, her champagne glass dangerously full in her hand. The alcohol had clearly taken effect, loosening the careful control she usually maintained over her words. "Yes, yes," she said, her voice slightly slurred but still carrying across the nearby tables. "Sarah deserves everything beautiful in life. She's always been the responsible one, the one who understood what family means." Several guests turned to listen as my mother continued, apparently unaware that her voice was carrying further than she intended. "We've made all the right decisions for our family's future. We kept everything where it belongs with the people who truly deserve it." She gestured broadly with her champagne glass, some of the liquid sloshing over the rim. "Sarah understands family loyalty. She would never turn her back on the people who raised her, never bite the hand that fed her. That's why we knew we were right to keep the inheritance in the family with someone who would honor our mother's memory properly instead of—" She trailed off, apparently realizing that she was saying more than she should, but the damage was done. The nearby tables had gone quiet, and I could see guests exchanging meaningful looks as they processed what they had just heard. "Did she just say inheritance?" I heard one woman whisper to her husband. "I thought Elena was supposed to inherit from the grandmother," another guest murmured. "Didn't old Mrs. Rodriguez always say she had 2 granddaughters? Where is Elena tonight anyway?" someone else asked. "I haven't seen her at all." The whispers spread from table to table like ripples in a pond, and I watched as the carefully orchestrated perfection of Sarah's wedding began to develop its first crack. My mother had revealed more than she intended about family finances and inheritance decisions that were supposed to remain private. My father quickly moved to his wife's side, gently taking the champagne glass from her hand and guiding her back to her seat, with the smooth efficiency of someone who had managed similar situations before. But the words couldn't be taken back, and the questions they raised wouldn't be easily dismissed. From my position in the service area, I had a clear view of the head table, and I watched Sarah's face carefully as the whispers continued to circulate around the ballroom. Most brides would have looked concerned or embarrassed by their mother's indiscreet comments about family financial matters at their wedding reception. But the bride's smile seemed almost too satisfied, like she knew exactly what her mother meant. The weight of recognition was crushing me, making it difficult to breathe in the stifling air of the reception. I needed space, needed somewhere private to process what was happening, so I excused myself and made my way to the women's restroom in the hotel's main lobby, away from the wedding festivities and the curious stares that had followed me since Robert Chen's enthusiastic recognition. The restroom was mercifully empty, all marble and gold fixtures that spoke of the hotel's 5-star status. I locked myself in the largest stall and sat on the closed toilet seat, my hands shaking as I tried to control my breathing. David Chen, David Miller, the same person who had systematically destroyed my life 27 years ago, now married to my sister and celebrated as the perfect son-in-law. The memories came flooding back with brutal clarity, now that I had a name and face to attach them to. That party in his off-campus apartment during finals week of my sophomore year. I had been exhausted from working 3 jobs while trying to maintain my grades running on caffeine and determination, when David had invited me to what he called a small study break with friends. I had been naive enough to believe him desperate enough for social connection to accept an invitation from someone who had been showing me attention for weeks. The apartment had been crowded with people I didn't recognize, music loud enough to make conversation impossible. Alcohol flowing freely from expensive bottles that David kept refilling my cup with, despite my protests that I needed to study. The room began to spin as the alcohol took effect faster than I expected. I remember trying to find a quiet corner to sit down. Remember David appearing beside me with another drink, his voice in my ear telling me I needed to relax, that I was too uptight, that he knew what I needed better than I did. What happened next was a blur of confusion and pain, of saying no, and being ignored, of trying to push him away, and being overpowered, of waking up the next morning in his bed with my clothes scattered on the floor and no memory of how I had gotten there. When I confronted him, tried to piece together what had happened, he had laughed and told me I was being dramatic, that I had been willing enough the night before. The pregnancy test 2 weeks later had shown 2 pink lines that changed everything. I was 19 years old, working minimum wage jobs, barely able to afford food and textbooks, and suddenly facing a future that seemed impossible to navigate. When I tried to tell David he had accused me of lying, of trying to trap him into a relationship he didn't want, of being that kind of girl who would make up stories to get attention. The rumors he spread about my mental state, my desperation, my supposed manipulation, had made it impossible to stay in school. Professors looked at me with suspicion. Classmates whispered when I passed, and the academic environment that had been my refuge became a source of daily humiliation. I had withdrawn from classes mid-semester, forfeiting my partial scholarship and any hope of completing my degree. The miscarriage had come during my 3rd month, a weekend of cramping and bleeding that I endured alone in my tiny studio apartment because I couldn't afford medical care and was too ashamed to tell my family what had happened. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of losing what had felt like my only chance at creating a family that might love me unconditionally. I had spent the next 2 years rebuilding myself piece by piece, working dead-end jobs and trying to figure out how to move forward when everything I had planned for my future had been destroyed. It wasn't until I was 22 that I was strong enough to even think about returning to school, and by then I had aged out of most scholarship opportunities and had to start over completely. Now, sitting in this expensive hotel restroom, I realized that David's appearance in my sister's life wasn't coincidence. Sacramento wasn't a small town where random encounters happened by chance. David had to have known that Sarah Rodriguez was my sister when he began pursuing her. He had to have researched our family, understood the connections, made a calculated decision to insert himself into the Rodriguez family story. But why? What could he possibly gain from marrying Sarah that he couldn't achieve through his own medical career and social connections? The answer came to me with sickening clarity as I remembered my mother's drunken comments about inheritance and keeping assets in the family where they belonged. David wasn't just marrying Sarah for love or social advancement. He was positioning himself to benefit from whatever family wealth my parents had been so careful to keep away from me. The same wealth that should have included my grandmother's inheritance, the same financial security that they had denied me while lavishing opportunities on Sarah. He had destroyed her once. Now she understood this wedding was his way of finishing the job. I composed myself in the restroom mirror, checking that my makeup hadn't been affected by the emotional turmoil of the past few minutes. The woman looking back at me was still polished, still professional, still in control despite the chaos raging inside. I needed to return to the reception and gather more information about what David was planning, but I also needed to be strategic about it. When I emerged from the restroom, I could hear voices coming from the hotel's business center, a small room adjacent to the lobby that was typically used by traveling executives who needed to make private calls or handle urgent matters. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized David's voice immediately speaking in the clipped tones of someone conducting serious business. I positioned myself near a decorative pillar where I could hear clearly without being seen, pretending to examine my phone while listening to what was obviously a confidential business conversation that David didn't want his new bride or wedding guests to overhear. "The preliminary numbers look good, Marcus," David was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. "The target company's revenue stream is solid, and their client base is exactly what we need to expand our financial services division." There was a pause as he listened to whoever Marcus was on the other end of the line. I pulled out my phone and activated the voice memo app, holding it casually as if I were checking messages. Phoenix Financial Solutions, David continued, and my blood ran cold at hearing my company's name spoken with such casual dismissal. It's some fintech startup focused on women's financial planning. The owner is apparently some woman who got lucky with timing and market positioning, but you know how these female-led companies operate. His tone shifted to something that made my skin crawl, the same condescending attitude I remembered from our college days, when he would explain things to me as if I were incapable of understanding basic concepts. Women entrepreneurs are typically much easier to negotiate with than their male counterparts, he said with obvious satisfaction. They tend to be more emotional in their decision-making, less experienced with high-stakes negotiations, and frankly more intimidated by aggressive tactics. I expect we'll be able to acquire Phoenix for significantly less than their actual market value. I had to grip the pillar to keep from walking into that room and confronting him immediately. This was the man who had just married my sister, who was being celebrated as the perfect addition to our family, casually discussing his plans to manipulate and undervalue the company I had built from nothing. The due diligence report shows some interesting vulnerabilities, David went on. The CEO apparently started the company after some kind of personal crisis, probably a divorce or bankruptcy, which suggests she might be motivated by emotional factors rather than pure business logic. That kind of psychological profile usually means they're looking for validation as much as profit. Every word was like a knife twist, not just because of his casual misogyny, but because of how completely wrong he was about my motivations and capabilities. He had no idea that the emotional female CEO he was planning to manipulate was the same woman he had destroyed in college, the same person who had spent decades building herself into someone who could match him strategy for strategy. The acquisition should be straightforward, David continued. We make an initial offer that seems generous but is actually 30% below market value, express concerns about the sustainability of their business model, and let them know that bigger players in the market are planning to crush small competitors like them. Standard intimidation tactics combined with a ticking clock should get us exactly the terms we want. There was another pause, and I could hear David chuckling at something his partner had said. Exactly, Marcus. These women-owned businesses always fold under pressure because they don't have the stomach for real corporate warfare. I've seen it a dozen times. They start companies because they want to make a difference or help other women. But when it comes to protecting their assets from serious players, they're completely out of their depth. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. David was describing his acquisition strategy for Phoenix Financial Solutions to his business partner, completely unaware that the CEO he was planning to intimidate and manipulate was sitting less than 20 feet away, recording every word of his arrogant assumptions. We should have the signed papers within 30 days, David concluded. The owner probably thinks she's running a successful business, but she's about to learn what happens when amateurs try to play in the big leagues. This acquisition will be like taking candy from a baby. I ended the recording and slipped my phone back into my purse, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just heard. David wasn't just planning to acquire my company. He was planning to do it through manipulation, intimidation, and outright fraud. He believed he could exploit what he saw as female weakness to steal everything I had built. She almost laughed he was trying to buy her own company from her. I returned to my isolated table with David's recorded conversation playing on repeat in my mind, the satisfaction of having that evidence almost overwhelming the rage I felt at his casual dismissal of women in business. I was reaching for my purse to secure my phone when it slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor beside my chair, with enough noise to draw attention from the nearby service staff. As I bent down to retrieve it, I felt my leather wallet shift inside my purse, and before I could catch it, the contents spilled across the polished floor. Business cards scattered in different directions, along with credit cards, cash, and the laminated identification badges that I carried for various professional organizations and board positions. I was gathering everything quickly, acutely aware that I was creating exactly the kind of scene my family had tried to avoid by hiding me in this corner when I heard a child's voice pipe up, with the innocent curiosity that only 8-year-olds possess. "Excuse me, lady," the little boy said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over our corner of the reception. "You dropped this pretty card." I looked up to see David's nephew, a cherubic child, in a miniature tuxedo, holding one of my identification badges, with the kind of fascination children show toward anything official-looking. The badge was one I rarely used, kept in my wallet mainly for sentimental reasons, rather than practical necessity. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, reaching for the badge, but the boy was already studying it with the intense concentration of a child learning to read. "Elena Rodriguez." He read aloud, his young voice stumbling slightly over the pronunciation, but carrying clearly across the service area. "Chief Executive Officer, Phoenix Financial Solutions." A small crowd of wedding guests had begun to gather at the sound of the commotion, including several who had heard Robert Chen's earlier praise of my company. I saw recognition dawning on their faces as they connected the dots between the CEO he had been discussing and the woman relegated to the kitchen table. But the child wasn't finished reading. His finger traced down to the second line of text on the badge, and his voice rose with excitement at deciphering the longer words. "Majority shareholder Miller and Associates." He continued proudly, then looked up at me with bright eyes. "Wow, that's a lot of big words. What does majority shareholder mean?" The question hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. I watched as the implications rippled through the crowd of onlookers, saw the moment when David's father-in-law processed what his grandson had just read, witnessed the exact instant when David himself appeared at the edge of the crowd, and heard those fatal words. "Ko oi," the child continued in the mix of English and Vietnamese, that his grandmother had been teaching him. "Ko la chu kum ti kwa ong wai David Are you the owner of Grandpa David's company?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every conversation in our corner of the reception stopped mid-sentence. Servers paused with their trays suspended in air. Even the ambient noise from the kitchen seemed to fade, as the full weight of what the child had innocently revealed settled over the assembled guests. I looked up from my position on the floor, still clutching the scattered contents of my wallet, and met David's eyes across the growing crowd. His face had gone completely white, his mouth slightly open in an expression of shock that would have been comical under different circumstances. Behind him, I could see my father pushing through the crowd, his own expression shifting from confusion to horrified understanding. The badge in the child's small hands contained information that changed everything anyone thought they knew about the family dynamics of this wedding. Not only was the dismissed daughter a successful CEO, but she owned controlling interest in the very company where the golden son-in-law worked, where he had built his post-medical career, where he drew the salary that allowed him to maintain his lifestyle and social position. The guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, phones appearing as people started to grasp the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a case of an underestimated family member. This was a complete reversal of the power structure that everyone had assumed defined the Rodriguez family hierarchy. "Is that really true?" I heard someone whisper. "She owns his company." "How is that possible?" another voice asked. "I thought she was the family failure." "Does Sarah know?" came a third whisper, more urgent than the others. All eyes turned toward the kitchen table where their biggest mistake was sitting with their biggest secret. The moment stretched like crystal, about to shatter every person in the vicinity, frozen in place as they processed what the innocent child had revealed. I remained on the floor for several heartbeats, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the crowd, watching as understanding dawned on face after face around me. Then I stood up slowly with the deliberate grace of someone who had just realized she held all the cards in a game everyone else thought they were winning. I smoothed my midnight blue suit, retrieved the identification badge from the child's small hands with a gentle smile, and slipped it back into my wallet with movements that seemed almost choreographed in their composure. "Thank you for finding my badge." I told the boy warmly, ruffling his hair before straightening to face the crowd that had gathered around my solitary table. The silence was so complete, I could hear the distant sound of the jazz quartet still playing in the main reception area, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the service corridor. I began walking toward the main reception, my heels clicking against the floor with measured precision. The crowd parted before me like water guests stepping back with expressions that ranged from shock to curiosity to something that might have been newfound respect. I could feel their eyes following my progress, could sense phones being discreetly pulled from purses and pockets as people began to comprehend that they were witnessing something extraordinary. As I passed the head table where my parents sat frozen in their formal wear, I paused just long enough to lean down toward my mother, who was staring at me with an expression of absolute horror. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand, and I could see her trying to process how the daughter she had relegated to the kitchen had just been revealed as the owner of her son-in-law's livelihood. "Thank you for the valuable lesson about seating arrangements," I said quietly, my voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, but carrying just enough edge to ensure she understood exactly what I meant. "I've learned so much about family priorities tonight." My father had gone completely pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if he needed physical support to remain upright. David stood somewhere behind me, but I didn't turn to acknowledge him. He had already received more attention than he deserved for one evening. I continued my unhurried exit through the main reception area, where conversations gradually quieted as guests noticed my progress and began to connect me with the whispers that were already starting to circulate. The elegant crowd that had earlier barely registered my presence was now watching my every step with fascination. Near the ballroom entrance, I could see phones appearing everywhere, discreet at first, but then more boldly as people realized they were witnessing a moment that demanded documentation. The soft glow of screens illuminated faces throughout the crowd as guests began typing furiously, sharing the unfolding drama with their social networks in real time. I heard fragments of conversation as I passed. "Did you see that badge? She owns his company. The sister they never talk about. This is incredible." Someone near the bar was already posting to Instagram, and I caught a glimpse of text that included the hashtag #BarCEO in the kitchen. The social media storm was beginning before I had even left the building. In an age where nothing remained private for long, Sarah's perfect wedding was about to become a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. The story was too delicious, too perfectly ironic for the internet to ignore the family scapegoat revealed as the secret power broker, the kitchen table that became a throne, the bride whose perfect day had been upstaged by the sister no one was supposed to remember. At the ballroom doors, I turned for one final look at the reception that was rapidly transforming from elegant celebration into chaos of whispered conversations and pointing fingers. Sarah sat at the head table in her wedding dress, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror as guests approached her with urgent questions she couldn't answer. David had disappeared entirely, probably retreating to process the implications of what had just been revealed. My parents remained frozen at their table, surrounded by family friends, who were no doubt eager to understand how they had so catastrophically misjudged their own daughter's position in the world. I walked through the hotel lobby and out into the Sacramento evening where my hired car was waiting as arranged. As I settled into the back seat and gave the driver the address of the airport, I could already see the glow of phones through the ballroom windows documenting what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about wedding disaster of the social season. But as the door closed behind her, she realized this was just the opening move. I was back in my Seattle penthouse by midnight, the city lights spread below me like a constellation of possibilities. The flight had given me time to process what had happened, to move beyond the emotional satisfaction of the moment and begin thinking strategically about what would come next. I knew my family well enough to predict their response, and I wasn't disappointed. My phone began ringing at exactly 6 a.m. Pacific time, which meant my parents had been awake since dawn Sacramento time, no doubt spending the early morning hours in crisis management mode. The caller ID showed my father's number, but when I answered, it was my mother's voice I heard pitched higher than usual with barely controlled panic. "Elena, sweetheart, we need to talk about what happened last night." She began without preamble, using the same artificially sweet tone she had employed at the reception. "There seems to have been some confusion about your business situation, and people got the wrong impression about our family dynamics." I settled into my leather chair with a cup of coffee, prepared to enjoy this conversation. "What kind of wrong impression, Mother?" "Well, people are saying things that make it sound like we don't support your career, which is obviously ridiculous. That seating arrangement was just a mistake by the wedding planner. You know how these event coordinators can be, they don't understand family relationships." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. Within 12 hours, my deliberate exile to the kitchen had been transformed into a vendor error, my years of absence from family events had become a misunderstanding, and my success had been reframed as something they had always celebrated. "I see," I said neutrally, letting her continue. "The important thing now is that we all stay calm and present a united front as a family. Some people took photos and videos last night, and you know how social media can blow things out of proportion. We just need to make sure everyone understands that this was all a big misunderstanding." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with what would turn out to be the first of 47 text messages from Sarah. I put my mother on speaker and began scrolling through them while she continued her damage control speech. "Elena, please call me back." The first message read sent at 2:17 a.m. "This is all getting out of hand and I need to explain. Mom told me about the seating thing. I had no idea they put you in the kitchen," came the second message sent 3 minutes later. "Please don't post anything on social media about tonight," read the third. "My wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and now everyone is talking about drama instead of celebrating with us." The messages continued throughout the night, growing increasingly desperate, as Sarah apparently realized that the story was spreading beyond their ability to control it. "David is freaking out about his job." One message read, "You can't seriously own his company, can you? Please tell me that was some kind of mistake." Meanwhile, my mother was still talking, her voice growing more strained as she worked through her prepared talking points. "We're hoping you can help us clarify things, maybe post something on your social media about what a wonderful time you had at the wedding, how proud you are of Sarah, that sort of thing. Just to balance out any negative impressions people might have gotten." I opened TikTok on my tablet while listening to her plead for my cooperation in rewriting history. The very first video in my feed was tagged "Her CEO in the kitchen," posted by someone who had been at the wedding. The clip showed me sitting alone at my table near the service area, then cut to the moment when the child read my identification badge, ending with my composed exit through the main reception. The video had 2.3 million views and was climbing rapidly. The comments were a mix of outrage on my behalf and fascination with the family drama. "This is why I have trust issues," one commenter had written. "Imagine treating your own daughter like this, and then finding out she's more successful than all of you." "Mother," I interrupted her monologue gently, "I think you should know that the story is already trending on multiple social media platforms. Her CEO in the kitchen has over 2 million views as of this morning." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear her processing the implications of what I had just told her. Social media was not a world my parents understood or could control, and the idea that their private family business was being discussed by millions of strangers had to be terrifying for people who had spent their lives carefully curating their public image. "Surely there's something you can do," she said finally, her voice smaller now. "You understand technology, you must have connections who can make this stop." The naivety was almost touching. She genuinely believed that success in business meant having the power to control viral content, to simply make inconvenient truths disappear because they threatened the family's reputation. But the internet never forgets, and neither does a woman with nothing left to lose. After ending the call with my mother, I walked to my home office and opened the secure files that contained the detailed results of the Miller & Associates acquisition. The transaction had been completed 3 months ago through a series of shell companies and investment funds that obscured my direct involvement, a standard practice in corporate acquisitions that helped prevent the kind of workplace disruption that occurred when employees learned their company had changed hands. I pulled up David Miller's personnel file, first curious to see what kind of employee my former tormentor had become. The digital folder was thicker than I expected, filled with performance reviews, client complaints, and disciplinary actions that painted a picture of someone who had coasted on charm and connections rather than competence. David Miller, Senior Manager, Business Development. Salary, $180,000 annually, plus bonuses. The employment record showed 14 separate incidents over the past 3 years. Inappropriate comments to female colleagues, expense account irregularities, missed deadlines on major client projects, and what HR diplomatically termed interpersonal conflicts with subordinates. Most telling was a complaint filed just 6 weeks ago by a junior female analyst who reported that David had made unwelcome advances during a business dinner, then retaliated by blocking her promotion when she declined his invitation to discuss her career prospects in his hotel room. The complaint had been buried in bureaucratic procedures, probably because David's manager at the time hadn't wanted to deal with the paperwork and potential legal complications. Reading through the file, I realized that David hadn't changed at all since college. He was still the same predator who used his position and charm to manipulate women. Still the same entitled man who believed rules didn't apply to him. The only difference was that now he had an MBA and a corporate title to hide behind. But the real revelation came when I opened the property management files for Phoenix Real Estate Holdings, one of the investment companies I had established to diversify beyond financial services. The portfolio included several residential properties in Sacramento that had been acquired over the past 5 years as rental investments managed by a local property management firm that handled tenant relations and maintenance issues. I scrolled through the tenant listings and felt my breath catch when I saw a familiar address, 1247 Maple Grove Drive, Sacramento. The house where I had grown up, where I had learned to walk and ride a bicycle and dream about my future before everything fell apart. The 4-bedroom colonial with the wraparound porch and the oak tree in the backyard where Sarah and I used to swing during summers that felt endless. The property had been purchased 3 years ago when the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage during a financial crisis. Phoenix Real Estate Holdings had bought it at auction for significantly below market value, then renovated it and put it back on the rental market. The current tenants were listed as Margaret and Carlos Rodriguez, lease term, 36 months monthly rent, $4,500. My parents had lost the house. The financial troubles that had driven my father to steal from the church fund had apparently continued long after I left, eventually forcing them to sell the family home and become renters in the neighborhood where they had once been homeowners. They had been living in their childhood home for 3 years, paying rent to a property management company that collected the checks on behalf of Phoenix Real Estate Holdings. They had been paying rent to me. Every month for 3 years, my father had written a check for $400 or $500, and my mother had probably complained about the cost, never knowing that the money was going directly into the bank account of the daughter they had disowned to protect their reputation. The irony was so perfect it took my breath away. The same house where they had confronted me about threatening their family's honor, where they had given me the ultimatum that forced me to choose between truth and belonging, was now owned by the company I had built from the ashes of their rejection. I opened the payment history and saw that they had been model tenants, never late, with rent, meticulous about property maintenance, always requesting permission before making any changes to the landscaping or decor. They had been taking care of their former home with the dedication of people who understood its value, people who remembered when it represented everything they had worked to achieve. Every month for 3 years, they had been paying rent to the daughter they disowned. The discovery about the house ownership left me staring at the computer screen for several minutes, processing the layers of irony that seemed to define every aspect of my relationship with my family. Before I could fully absorb the implications, my phone rang again. This time it was a conference call with all 3 of them on the line, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of damage control and blame assignment. "Elena, this has gone too far." my mother began without any greeting, her voice sharp with the kind of anger that comes from losing control of a situation. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you've managed to completely ruin Sarah's wedding day with your dramatic little performance. It wasn't dramatic, Mom, I said calmly, settling back in my chair. It was just the truth, finally coming to light. The truth? Sarah's voice cut in higher-pitched than usual, with stress and exhaustion. The truth is that you deliberately sabotaged my wedding because you couldn't stand seeing me happy. You've always been jealous of what I have, and now you're trying to destroy it. The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Sarah, I haven't thought about your life in years. I was simply attending your wedding as invited, sitting where your family placed me. That's exactly what I'm talking about, my mother interrupted. You knew perfectly well that the kitchen seating was a mistake by the event coordinator, but instead of quietly handling it like a mature adult, you decided to create a scene that would embarrass our entire family. Actually, Mother, let's talk about that seating arrangement, I said, pulling up the email thread that had been forwarded to me by a helpful wedding guest who thought I should know the truth. Because I have some interesting correspondence here about how those arrangements were made. The silence that followed told me they knew exactly what emails I was referring to. Sarah, I continued reading from my screen. Would you like to explain your message to the wedding planner that said, and I quote, "Please make sure my sister Elena is seated away from the main reception area. Somewhere quiet, where she won't draw attention or create awkward conversations with the important guests." I was trying to protect you, Sarah said quickly, but her voice had lost its indignant edge. I knew you'd be uncomfortable around people you didn't know, so I thought a quieter spot would be better for everyone. You specifically requested that I be seated as far from the head table as possible, and mentioned that I had issues with social situations that might be disruptive to the celebration. The evidence was damning, and we all knew it. Sarah had orchestrated my exile to the kitchen not out of oversight or vendor error, but as a deliberate strategy to minimize my presence at her perfect wedding. She had anticipated that I might attend, and had planned accordingly to ensure I remained invisible. Elena, you have to understand, Sarah continued, her voice now pleading rather than angry. I had no idea about your business success. If I had known you were some kind of CEO, obviously the seating would have been different. So my worth as a family member is determined by my professional success? I asked. If I had remained the struggling failure you all believed me to be, then the kitchen seating would have been appropriate. That's not what she meant, my mother interjected, but her defense lacked conviction. Throughout this entire conversation, my father had remained completely silent. Not a single word of greeting, explanation, or defense. His silence was more painful than all of my mother's accusations and Sarah's justifications combined, because it suggested that he had nothing to say in defense of how I had been treated, no explanation for why his daughter had been relegated to eating with the service staff at his other daughter's wedding. Dad, I said, finally addressing him directly, do you have anything to add to this conversation? More silence. I could hear him breathing on the line, could sense his presence, but no words came. It was the same silence that had followed me out of their house 27 years ago, the same absence of advocacy that had defined our relationship since the day I had threatened to expose his theft. Your father is just upset, my mother said, finally speaking for him as she always had. We're all upset about how this situation has been blown out of proportion. Blown out of proportion? I repeated. Your son-in-law works for a company I own, you're renting the family home from a company I own, and you seated me in the kitchen at a wedding where I was apparently the most successful person in the room. But somehow this is being blown out of proportion. The implications were finally sinking in, and I could hear the shift in their voices as they began to understand the true scope of their miscalculation. But they still didn't understand she wasn't here for their approval anymore. The confrontation with my family left me emotionally drained, but more determined than ever to understand the full scope of what had been orchestrated around Sarah's wedding. I was reviewing the property management files again, when my assistant called to inform me that a package had been delivered to my office by courier marked urgent and confidential. 20 minutes later, I was back in my downtown office examining a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that simply said, "You deserve to know the truth about your sister's intentions. A friend." I plugged the drive into my secure laptop, half expecting it to contain malware or some kind of corporate espionage attempt. Instead, what I found was a treasure trove of email communications between Sarah and David, dating back 8 months long before their engagement was even publicly announced. The earliest emails in the thread were casual, flirtatious messages between two people who were obviously attracted to each other, but still in the tentative stages of courtship. But as I scrolled deeper into their correspondence, the tone shifted to something much more calculating and deliberate. "I did some research on your family background," David had written in an email dated 6 months ago. "Your sister Elena has built quite an impressive business empire. Phoenix Financial Solutions has been getting attention from some major players in the acquisition market." Sarah's response was immediate and telling. "Oh God, you know about Elena. I was hoping to avoid that topic for as long as possible. She's always been the family embarrassment, but lately she's been getting some press coverage that makes her look more successful than she actually is." "Actually," David had replied, "I think your sister might be exactly the opportunity we've been looking for. If she's really built the kind of company the business journals are reporting, there could be significant financial advantages to cultivating a relationship with her." The email thread that followed laid out a plan so cynical it took my breath away. Sarah and David had researched my company extensively, had identified the potential value of building a connection with me, and had strategized about how to leverage my success for their own benefit. "The key is not to seem too eager," Sarah had written. "Elena has always been suspicious of family attention because she knows we never paid much attention to her growing up. We need to make this feel natural, like we're genuinely trying to reconnect as siblings." David's response revealed the depth of his manipulation. "I can approach this from the business angle. If she's as successful as the reports suggest, she'll need strategic partnerships with established firms. Miller & Associates could be positioned as the perfect complementary service provider." But the most damaging emails came from just 3 weeks before the wedding, when their plan had evolved into something even more mercenary. "Once we're married and have established legitimacy with Elena's business network," David had written, "we can start the real wealth extraction. Her company is probably worth 8 figures by now, and if we play this right, we could position ourselves to benefit from that success long term." Sarah's reply was clinical in its calculation. "The prenup protects my family assets, but if you can gain access to Elena's business connections, and maybe even investment opportunities, we could build our own portfolio completely separate from anything that could be traced back to the Rodriguez family money." The final email in the thread was dated just 1 week before the wedding. "Are you sure she'll actually show up?" David had asked. "She'll come," Sarah had responded with certainty. "Elena's always been desperate for family approval, even though she pretends she doesn't care. The wedding invitation will be too tempting for her to resist. And when she does show up, we'll be ready to welcome her back into the family with exactly the kind of attention she's always craved." The last line of Sarah's email made me physically sick. "After we've extracted everything useful from the relationship, the marriage can run its natural course. With Elena's business connections and the assets we'll accumulate, I won't need to stay married to someone I barely tolerate just for financial security." I read through the entire thread twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting their intentions. But there was no ambiguity in their correspondence. Sarah and David had orchestrated their entire relationship, planned their wedding, and invited me to participate in their celebration as part of an elaborate con game designed to exploit my success for their financial benefit. The Golden Daughter had been playing a game far dirtier than anyone imagined. I was still processing the implications of Sarah and David's emails when my secretary buzzed to inform me that an elderly gentleman was requesting to see me without an appointment. He had introduced himself as Edward Harrison, attorney at law, and claimed to have urgent business regarding my late grandmother's estate. Edward Harrison appeared to be in his 70s with the kind of distinguished bearing that came from decades of handling confidential legal matters for wealthy families. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit was expensive but understated, and he carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been crafted sometime in the 1970s and maintained with meticulous care ever since. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said as he settled into the chair across from my desk. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but recent events have made it necessary for me to share information that I've been holding in trust for many years." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it carefully on my desk. "I was your grandmother's attorney for 38 years, and I've been waiting for the right time to execute the final provisions of her will. The viral nature of your recent family encounter has convinced me that the time has come." The folder contained documents I had never seen before, starting with adoption papers dated when I was 3 years old. According to the legal paperwork, I had been born Elena Maria Santos to a teenage mother who had died in a car accident when I was 2. My biological father was unknown, and I had been in foster care for 8 months when Isabella Rodriguez, my grandmother, petitioned the court to adopt me. "Your grandmother never intended for this information to remain secret," Edward explained as I read through the adoption records. "She planned to tell you about your origins when you turned 18, but she died unexpectedly when you were 17. The next document in the folder was a handwritten letter in my grandmother's familiar script, dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Elena," it began. "If you are reading this, then Edward has determined that the truth about your inheritance has been obscured by people who should have protected your interests." I looked up at Edward, who nodded gravely. "Your parents were named as trustees of your inheritance until you reached age 25, with instructions to use the funds for your education and welfare. They were never intended to be the beneficiaries themselves." The letter continued. "You came to me when you needed love most, and you brought joy to our family in ways that Sarah, bless her heart, never could. You have my creative spirit, my determination, and my ability to see possibilities where others see only problems. Everything I have built is meant to ensure your future because you are the granddaughter of my heart, chosen rather than simply born into this family." The final document in the folder was a certified copy of my grandmother's original will, dated and notarized just weeks before her death. The language was clear and unambiguous. "To my beloved granddaughter Elena Maria Rodriguez, who brought light into my final years, and who represents everything I hope our family can become, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all financial assets, real property, and personal belongings." The estate inventory attached to the will showed assets totaling $8.5 million in 1998, including the family home commercial properties investment accounts, and a collection of artwork and jewelry that had been in the Rodriguez family for generations. "The will that was probated after your grandmother's death," Edward said quietly, "was a forgery. Your parents altered the document to name Sarah as the primary beneficiary, using your absence from the family as justification for why you were not present during the probate proceedings." I stared at the authentic will, trying to process the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. Not only had my family cast me out to protect their reputation, but they had systematically looted an inheritance that would have made my desperate early years in Seattle completely unnecessary. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "Because," Edward said with a slight smile, "watching your family's reaction to discovering your success has convinced me that they will never voluntarily acknowledge what they've done. And because the statute of limitations on inheritance fraud in California is 10 years from discovery of the crime, not from when it was committed. She wasn't the black sheep who didn't belong, she was the chosen heir they tried to erase." Edward Harrison had barely left my office when my secretary announced that my parents were in the lobby requesting to see me immediately. I almost told her to send them away, but curiosity about their damage control strategy convinced me to agree to the meeting. They appeared in my office 15 minutes later, my mother carrying an elaborate bouquet of white orchids that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. My father held a cream-colored envelope that I assumed contained some form of written apology, carefully crafted to minimize their legal exposure while appearing contrite. Elena, darling. My mother began setting the flowers on my conference table with the kind of theatrical gesture she had perfected for social occasions. We've come to talk to you privately as a family, away from all the social media nonsense and public speculation. My father remained silent, as had become his pattern, but he nodded gravely as if to emphasize the seriousness of their mission. He handed me the envelope, which contained a 2-page letter written in my mother's careful handwriting, expressing regret for the misunderstandings that have created distance between us as a family. We want you to know that we never intended for you to feel unwelcome at Sarah's wedding. My mother continued, settling into the chair across from my desk as if she were a client seeking financial advice. The seating arrangement was a miscommunication, and we're horrified that it created such an uncomfortable situation for you. I read through their letter while she spoke, noting how carefully they had crafted language that acknowledged hurt feelings without admitting to deliberate malice. There was no mention of the inheritance fraud, no reference to the years of silence, no acknowledgement that their treatment of me had been systematic rather than accidental. We realize that we may not have been as supportive of your career as we should have been, my father said finally, breaking his silence. We're proud of what you've accomplished with your business, and we want to find a way to repair our relationship as a family. For 20 minutes, I listened to their carefully rehearsed presentation about family healing, about how much they missed having me in their lives, about their desire to be part of my success story going forward. They spoke about grandchildren they hoped to meet someday, about family traditions they wanted to share, about the importance of forgiveness in maintaining family bonds. Throughout their presentation, I remained professionally courteous, offering them coffee and listening with the same attention I would give to any business proposal. But I made no commitments, offered no forgiveness, and gave them no indication that their words were having the desired effect. I appreciate you coming here, I said finally, when they had exhausted their prepared talking points. This is clearly important to you, and I want you to know that I've heard everything you've said. So you'll consider giving us another chance? My mother asked hopefully. I'll consider everything you've shared with me today, I replied, choosing my words carefully. But I think it's important that we all understand the reality of our situation going forward. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline while I formulated my response. If we're going to have any kind of relationship in the future, it will be on my terms with my boundaries and according to my schedule. I won't be attending family gatherings where I'm treated as an afterthought. I won't be participating in conversations about my personal life or business decisions unless I choose to share that information. And I won't be pretending that the past 27 years didn't happen just to make everyone more comfortable. My parents exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such specific conditions. Most importantly, I continued, any future contact between us will be voluntary on my part. No more surprise visits, no more demands for immediate responses to family crises, no more assumptions that I owe anyone an explanation for my choices. They left my office that afternoon with polite promises to think about everything and respect my need for space. But I could see in their eyes that they didn't truly understand what had changed between us. They were still operating under the assumption that the right combination of apologies and promises could restore the family dynamic they remembered. Some wounds don't heal with apologies, they heal with distance. The meeting with my parents had clarified exactly where we stood, but there was still one piece of unfinished business that required my immediate attention. I scheduled a formal HR meeting with the management team at Miller & Associates for the following Tuesday, requesting that David Miller be present to discuss his employment status and future with the company. The conference room at Miller & Associates felt smaller than I remembered from my previous visits, but then again, I had never sat at the head of the table as the majority owner before. David entered the room 10 minutes late, clearly assuming this was some routine employee evaluation that he could charm his way through with minimal effort. His confident expression faltered when he saw me sitting beside the HR director with a thick folder of documents spread across the mahogany table. For a moment he seemed frozen in the doorway, as if his brain couldn't process why the woman from his wedding disaster was now occupying the power position in his workplace. "Please, sit down, David," I said calmly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "We have several items to discuss regarding your employment with this company." I opened the folder and withdrew a 23-page report that had been compiled by our internal investigation team over the past week. This document contains a comprehensive review of your professional conduct over the past 3 years, including documented violations of company policy, ethical breaches, and misuse of corporate resources. David's face went pale as I began reading from the executive summary. 14 separate instances of inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues. 7 documented cases of expense account fraud. Multiple missed deadlines resulting in client complaints. And most recently, the use of company communication systems to coordinate personal business schemes. The HR director, a competent woman named Patricia Wong, who had been briefed on the full scope of David's misconduct, took over the presentation of evidence. She methodically reviewed each violation, providing dates, witness statements, and documentation that painted a picture of an employee who had consistently abused his position and authority. "David," I said when Patricia finished her presentation, "do you have any response to these allegations?" He cleared his throat and leaned forward suddenly, adopting the earnest apologetic demeanor that had probably worked for him in previous situations where he needed to talk his way out of trouble. "Elena, I think there might be some personal history affecting your judgment here," he said, his voice taking on the concerned tone of someone trying to be reasonable with an unstable person. "We knew each other briefly in college, and I know there were some misunderstandings between us back then." The audacity of calling what he had done to me a misunderstanding was breathtaking, but I maintained my professional composure. "You're suggesting that we dated in college, and now I'm using my business position to settle personal scores?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he planned to spin this narrative. "Look, we were both young, we both made mistakes," he continued, apparently believing that charm and false humility would save his career. "What happened between us was just college stuff, kid stuff, really. Surely we can move past all that and focus on what's best for the company going forward." I let him finish his plea for forgiveness and second chances, noting how he managed to minimize his past behavior while positioning himself as the mature party, willing to overlook my supposed vindictiveness. "You're absolutely right that this isn't about personal history," I said finally. "This is about professional standards and corporate accountability." I picked up the termination paperwork and signed it with steady hands, my signature clear and decisive on the official company letterhead. "Your employment with Miller & Associates is terminated immediately effective today. Security will escort you to clean out your office, and all company property, including your laptop, phone, and access cards, must be surrendered before you leave the building." David stared at me in shock, apparently unable to process that his attempts at manipulation had not only failed, but had actually made his situation worse. "This isn't personal, David," I said, standing to indicate that the meeting was concluded. "It's professional standards." He finally understood the girl he destroyed had become the woman who owned his world. David's termination from Miller & Associates became public knowledge within hours, but the real devastation to his reputation came from the private investigation report that arrived at Sarah's apartment the next morning. I had hired a discreet investigative firm the week before, not out of vindictiveness, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what David had been doing behind the scenes of his supposedly perfect marriage. The 40-page report was comprehensive and damaging. 3 separate extramarital relationships over the past 2 years, each carefully documented with photographs, hotel receipts, and credit card statements. The first affair had been with a pharmaceutical sales representative who had been calling on his medical practice. The second was with a colleague from Miller & Associates who had since transferred to the company's Los Angeles office. The third and most recent was with a woman he had met at the gym who had no idea he was married until the investigator informed her as part of gathering evidence. Each relationship followed the same pattern David had used with me in college, intense initial attention promises about future plans together, then gradual manipulation and emotional abuse when the women began asking for more commitment. The pharmaceutical rep had filed a complaint with her company about his increasingly demanding behavior. The colleague had requested the transfer to escape what she described as his obsessive pursuit. The gym acquaintance had blocked his phone number after he showed up at her workplace uninvited. I had copies of the report delivered to Sarah, to David, and to the partners at Miller & Associates, who were still processing the implications of having employed someone with such a troubling pattern of professional and personal misconduct. Sarah's response was swift and strategic. By noon the day after David's termination, she had filed for divorce and petitioned the court for an emergency restraining order, claiming that she had discovered evidence of her husband's deceptive and potentially dangerous behavior and feared for her safety. The legal filing was a masterpiece of damage control, positioning Sarah as the innocent victim who had been deceived by a manipulative husband, rather than as a co-conspirator in their scheme to exploit my business success. She requested immediate separation of all marital assets and asked the court to freeze their joint accounts pending a full forensic accounting of their finances. But when Sarah tried to access their primary checking and savings accounts, she discovered that David had been several steps ahead of her. Most of their liquid assets had been transferred to offshore accounts during the weeks following their wedding, apparently as part of his preparation for the business partnership he had planned to propose to me. The irony was perfect. In trying to position himself to exploit my success, David had essentially stolen from his new wife, leaving her with limited access to the marital assets she was trying to protect through divorce proceedings. The Sacramento Bee picked up the story 3 days later, running it under the headline, "$1 Million Wedding Becomes $1 Million Mistake." The article detailed the viral social media coverage of the wedding, David's termination from his job for professional misconduct, and the subsequent divorce filing with its allegations of financial deception and infidelity. Local television stations followed with their own coverage, interviewing wedding guests who had witnessed my dramatic exit and were happy to share their perspectives on the family drama that had unfolded that evening. The story had everything that made for compelling local news: wealth scandal, family secrets, and social media virality. Within a week, Sarah and David's marriage had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media exposure and the importance of really knowing someone before making a lifetime commitment. Talk radio hosts used their story as an example of how quickly a picture-perfect life could unravel when the truth came to light. But the biggest scandal was still buried in the family vault. The media frenzy surrounding Sarah and David's collapsed marriage had died down after 2 weeks. But the aftermath continued to ripple through Sacramento's social circles in ways that kept my family's name in whispered conversations at country clubs and charity events. I found myself oddly detached from the drama, focused instead on the practical matter of relocating Phoenix Financial's headquarters from our current downtown Seattle office to a larger space that could accommodate our rapidly expanding team. It was while packing up my personal office that I discovered the letter tucked inside an old business school textbook I had kept for sentimental reasons. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Rodriguez in my own handwriting, but the return address was from my tiny studio apartment in Capitol Hill from 25 years ago. I had no memory of writing it, but seeing my younger self's careful penmanship brought back the desperate loneliness of those early Seattle years. The letter was dated March 15th, written when I would have been 20 years old and struggling to rebuild my life after the miscarriage that had derailed my college plans. The paper was cheap stationery from a discount store, the kind I could afford when every dollar had to be stretched to cover basic necessities. Dear Mom, it began, and I could immediately hear the voice of my younger self, still hoping that the right words might bridge the gap that had opened between us. I know it's been almost 2 years since I left home, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand what really happened. The letter went on for 3 handwritten pages, a raw outpouring of pain and confusion from a young woman who still believed that explaining herself clearly enough might earn her family's forgiveness. I had written about the miscarriage, about dropping out of school, about working multiple jobs, while trying to figure out how to move forward with my life. I know I disappointed you by not becoming the daughter you wanted me to be. The letter continued. I know I caused problems for our family, and I know I hurt Dad's reputation in the community. I've spent every day since I left trying to understand how I could have handled things differently. Reading those words now from the perspective of a successful woman who had built her own life on her own terms, I felt a deep sadness for the 20-year-old who had written them. She had been so convinced that she was the problem, so desperate to take responsibility for adult failings that had nothing to do with her choices or character. The letter included an apology for not being strong enough to keep the family together, and a promise to stay away until I can figure out how to be the kind of person who brings honor to the Rodriguez name instead of shame. There was a paragraph about my dreams of finishing college someday, about hoping to build a career that would make them proud, about wanting to prove that their investment in raising me hadn't been wasted. The final paragraph was the most heartbreaking. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to send this letter, but I wanted you to know that I think about you and Dad and Sarah every day. I hope someday I'll become someone worthy of being your daughter again. I sat in my office chair, surrounded by boxes of financial reports and business awards, holding this artifact from a version of myself I barely remembered. The woman who had written this letter had believed that love was something you earned through perfect behavior, that family was a privilege that could be revoked if you failed to meet expectations, that her worth as a person was determined by other people's approval. She had been so young, so broken, so convinced that the adults who should have protected her were right to cast her out for threatening their carefully constructed lies. She had carried the shame of their choices as if it belonged to her, had spent years trying to transform herself into someone worthy of conditional love. But I was no longer that desperate young woman begging for acceptance. I had learned that real family doesn't require you to minimize yourself to make others comfortable, that love isn't something you earn through perfect compliance, that the people who truly matter will celebrate your success rather than resent it. I walked to the window and held the letter up to the afternoon light, watching the sun illuminate words that had been written by someone I had once been but was no longer. Then I carried it to the small fireplace in my office, struck a match, and watched 20 years of misplaced shame curl into flames. She burned the letter and watched 20 years of pain turn to ash. She had nothing left to prove. The ashes of that old letter were still settling in my fireplace when my assistant forwarded me an email that would change everything. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, host of Second Chapter Success, was requesting an interview for her podcast that focused on women who had built meaningful careers after age 40. The show had over 500,000 regular listeners and had become something of a phenomenon among professional women who were tired of hearing that their best years were behind them. I've been following the story of your recent family situation through social media, Dr. Walsh wrote, and I think our listeners would be incredibly inspired by your journey from personal crisis to professional triumph. Would you consider sharing your story on our show? I had been avoiding media requests since the wedding debacle, but something about her approach felt different. She wasn't looking for gossip or family drama. She was interested in the business lessons and personal growth that had emerged from my experience. After burning that letter, I felt ready to tell my story on my own terms without the shame or desperation that had defined my younger self. The interview was conducted via video call from my office with Dr. Walsh, asking thoughtful questions about entrepreneurship, resilience, and the unique challenges women face when starting over later in life. I spoke about the experience of being written off by people who should have supported me, about learning to value my own judgment over other people's approval, and about building something meaningful from the ground up. I was disowned by my family in my late teens, I said, choosing my words carefully to focus on universal themes rather than specific accusations. They believed I was headed down the wrong path, and they decided the best thing for everyone involved was for me to find my own way in the world. I talked about arriving in Seattle with nothing about working 3 jobs while developing business skills, about the moment I realized that my financial struggles had given me insights that could help other women in similar situations. The company I eventually built came directly from my own need to manage money carefully when I had very little of it, I explained. I discovered that traditional financial services weren't designed for women who were rebuilding their lives, who didn't have steady incomes or family safety nets. Dr. Walsh asked about the moment when my success became undeniable, and I found myself describing the wedding without naming names or dwelling on the personal drama. I attended a family event recently where they had seated me in the kitchen away from the other guests, I said with a slight smile. A child accidentally revealed that I owned the company where one of the family members worked. It was a perfect example of how people's assumptions about others can be completely wrong. The conversation flowed naturally toward broader themes about forgiveness, family dynamics, and the importance of defining success for yourself rather than seeking validation from others. I spent years trying to prove myself worthy of love that came with conditions, I said. The real breakthrough came when I realized that unconditional love doesn't require you to be anyone other than who you are. The interview lasted 45 minutes, and by the time we finished, I felt like I had finally told my story the way it deserved to be told, as a narrative about resilience and growth, rather than victimhood and revenge. Within 24 hours, the episode had been shared over 50,000 times across social media platforms. The comments section was filled with women sharing their own stories of family rejection, career reinvention, and finding strength they didn't know they possessed. "This made me cry in the best way," one listener wrote. "I'm 43 and starting my own business after my divorce, and hearing this gave me hope that I can build something beautiful from the pieces." The episode resonated particularly strongly with women in their 40s and 50s who had been told it was too late to change their lives, too risky to pursue their dreams, too selfish to prioritize their own goals over family expectations. And somewhere in the city, her mother sat in her car crying after listening to every word. The overwhelming response to the podcast interview made me realize that my story had touched something deeper than I had expected. Hundreds of women reached out through social media and email sharing their own experiences of starting over after family rejection, divorce, or career upheaval. Many were in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, convinced that their opportunities for reinvention had passed them by. Their messages convinced me that this moment represented more than just personal vindication. It was an opportunity to transform my own painful experience into something that could genuinely help other women rebuild their lives. Within 2 weeks of the podcast's release, I had made the decision to establish the Phoenix Second Chance Fund with an initial commitment of $2 million from my personal assets. The fund's mission was specific and targeted providing financial support, business mentoring, and practical resources to women over 45 who were starting entrepreneurial ventures after major life disruptions. Whether they were recovering from divorce, job loss, family estrangement, or health crises, the fund would offer both capital and guidance to women who had been written off by traditional funding sources. I spent months developing partnerships with organizations that already served women in transition. Community colleges offered workspace and business development classes. Women's shelters provided referrals for their clients who were ready to rebuild their economic independence. Local churches, regardless of denomination, helped identify women in their congregations who had entrepreneurial dreams but lacked resources to pursue them. The most crucial partnerships came with 3 local radio stations whose morning shows had significant female listenership in the target demographic. These hosts understood that many women in their 40s and beyond felt invisible in a culture that celebrated youth and traditional success paths. They agreed to regularly feature fund recipients and provide free advertising for women-owned businesses that emerged from the program. The fund's launch event was held at the Seattle Convention Center on a rainy Thursday evening in November. I had hoped for maybe 100 attendees, mostly professionals and community leaders who could help spread word about the program. Instead, over 300 women showed up, many having driven from other cities after hearing about the event through word of mouth and social media. The energy in that room was unlike anything I had experienced in my business career. These weren't just potential fund applicants. They were women who had been carrying their own stories of resilience and reinvention, finally finding a space where those experiences were valued rather than dismissed. I spoke for 20 minutes about the fund's goals and application process, but the real power of the evening came from the women who stood up to share their own second chapter dreams. A 52-year-old former teacher wanted to start a tutoring service for immigrant children. A divorced mother of 3 had developed a meal planning app for busy single parents. A woman who had been laid off at 58 was launching a consulting firm focused on age diversity in the workplace. By the end of the evening, local business leaders in attendance had committed an additional $500,000 in funding, and 12 companies had volunteered to provide pro bono services ranging from legal advice to marketing support. More importantly, connections were forming in real time as women discovered others with complementary skills and shared challenges. The fund officially began accepting applications in January, and within 6 months, we had provided seed funding to 43 women-owned startups across the Pacific Northwest. The success rate was remarkable. 87% of funded businesses were still operating profitably after their first year, a figure that far exceeded industry averages for new ventures. But the real measure of success wasn't in the financial metrics. It was in the transformation I saw in the women themselves. They had discovered that their life experience, rather than being a liability, was actually their greatest business asset. They understood their target markets intimately because they had lived through the challenges their services addressed. She was no longer just a survivor telling her story, she was a lighthouse guiding others home. The letter arrived 3 months after the Phoenix Second Chance Fund launch, delivered by certified mail to my office address rather than my home. The return address showed only my mother's name in the familiar script I remembered from childhood birthday cards and school permission slips. The envelope contained 6 pages of cream-colored stationery filled with my mother's careful handwriting in the dark blue ink she had always preferred. Unlike the carefully crafted damage control letter she and my father had presented in my office months earlier, this one felt raw and unfiltered, as if she had written it in a single sitting without editing or revision. "My dearest Elena," it began, and I could almost hear her voice speaking the words as I read them. "I listened to your podcast interview 3 times, and each time I heard something that broke my heart a little more. Not because of what you said about our family, but because of how much pain I heard in your voice when you talked about feeling unwanted." The letter went on to describe her experience listening to me speak about starting over after family rejection, about building a life from nothing, about learning to value my own worth instead of seeking approval from others. She wrote about crying in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store after the first listen, then driving home to write this letter she had been avoiding for 27 years. "I need you to understand that your father and I were terrified," she continued. "Not of what you had discovered about the church money, though that was certainly frightening enough. We were terrified of what people would think of our family if the truth came out. Your grandmother had always been so proud of the Rodriguez name, so careful about our reputation in the community." She described the pressure she had felt as a young mother, the constant scrutiny from her mother-in-law about how the children were being raised, the fear that any scandal would reflect poorly on their ability to maintain the family's standing. She wrote about sleepless nights, worrying that my father's gambling debts would destroy everything they had worked to build. "When you threatened to expose what your father had done, I panicked," she admitted. "I thought about what it would mean for Sarah's future, for our position at church, for your father's business relationships. I convinced myself that protecting the family meant protecting everyone, including you." The most painful part of the letter came in the 4th page, where she acknowledged the years of silence that had followed my departure. "I told myself that you were better off without us, that you would build a stronger life if you weren't weighed down by our problems. But the truth was that I was a coward. I was afraid to face what we had done to you, afraid to admit that we had chosen our reputation over our daughter." She wrote about watching my success from a distance, about seeing my name in business publications, and feeling simultaneously proud and ashamed. "I wanted to reach out so many times over the years, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had grown so wide between us. Every year that passed made it harder to imagine how I could possibly explain or justify what we had done." The letter included an apology that felt different from the performative version she had delivered in my office. This one acknowledged specific harms admitted to choices that had prioritized comfort over courage and asked for nothing in return except the chance to tell me that she understood now how badly they had failed me as parents. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote in the final pages. "I don't even know if I deserve the chance to try to repair what we broke. But I needed you to know that your father and I have lived with the consequences of our choices every single day since you left. We lost the daughter who challenged us to be better people who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult." Reading those words, I felt tears I hadn't expected, not from relief or vindication, but from a deep sadness for all the years that had been lost to fear and pride. The letter revealed a woman who had spent decades carrying the weight of a decision made in panic, who had chosen silence over the harder work of accountability and repair. But as I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for their approval or validation. I had built a life that fulfilled me, created work that mattered, and found ways to transform my painful experiences into something that could help others. The letter remained unanswered on my desk for weeks, not because I was crafting a response, but because I had finally understood that my healing didn't require their participation. Forgiveness didn't need an audience. Sometimes it was just about letting go. The email arrived 6 months after my mother's letter from someone named Patricia Chen, who identified herself as a wedding guest from Sarah's reception. The subject line read, "A photo I thought you should see," and I almost deleted it without opening, assuming it was another request for an interview or business opportunity. Instead, the email contained a single photograph with a brief message. "I was sitting near the kitchen area that evening and captured this moment right after the little boy read your badge. I thought you might want to have it." The image took my breath away. It showed me sitting at that small table beside the service area, but it wasn't the humiliating scene I remembered. In Patricia's photograph, I looked serene, almost regal in my midnight blue suit. My posture was straight, my expression calm, and the CEO badge on the table caught the light from the chandeliers, making it appear to glow like a jewel. Behind me, the blurred figures of the catering staff went about their work, but I appeared completely at peace in the midst of what should have been chaos. I had expected to see defeat in that image, the visual evidence of my family's attempt to diminish me. Instead, I saw a woman who belonged exactly where she was, who had turned an insult into a position of quiet strength. The kitchen hadn't diminished me. It had become my throne room. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Maria Santos, editor of Inspire Women, a magazine focused on female leadership and empowerment. She had seen Patricia's photograph, which had been shared on social media with my permission, and wanted to discuss using it for their next cover story. "We're planning an issue about power in unexpected places," Maria explained during our phone conversation. "Your photograph captures something we've been trying to articulate for years about how true leadership shows up wherever it's needed, not just in boardrooms and corner offices." The proposed cover headline was, "Power Belongs Everywhere," with a feature story about women who had transformed challenging circumstances into platforms for positive change. They wanted to use the wedding photograph as the centerpiece, along with images of other women who had found strength in unconventional settings, a teacher who ran a school board meeting from a hospital bed, a CEO who closed a major deal while volunteering at a homeless shelter, a scientist who made a breakthrough discovery while on maternity leave. I agreed to the cover, but with one condition: any proceeds from magazine sales that month would be donated to the Phoenix Second Chance Fund. Maria enthusiastically accepted the terms, and the issue became one of their best-selling editions of the year. The impact extended far beyond magazine circulation. Women's organizations across the country requested permission to use the photograph in their own materials. Community centers, business incubators, and support groups for women in transition began displaying poster-sized versions of the image in their lobbies and meeting rooms. I received emails from women who said the photograph had been posted in their therapist's office, their divorce attorney's waiting room, their career counselor's workspace. One woman wrote that she kept a copy taped to her bathroom mirror as a daily reminder that dignity couldn't be taken away by other people's actions, only surrendered by our own choices. The photograph appeared in presentations at women's leadership conferences and social media campaigns about workplace equality, and in academic papers about resilience and reframing. It had become something larger than the moment it captured, transforming from documentation of a family slight into a symbol of unshakable self-worth. A year after its initial publication, the image was selected for permanent display at the National Museum of Women's History as part of an exhibit called Redefining Success: Women Who Changed the Rules. The museum's curator explained that they chose it because it represented the moment when external attempts to diminish a woman's worth met the immovable force of her own self-knowledge. Standing in that museum, looking at my own image enlarged and professionally displayed alongside photographs of pioneering women throughout history, I felt a profound sense of completion. The picture that was meant to humiliate her had become her crown. Edward Harrison appeared at my office again 6 months after our first meeting, this time carrying a wooden box that looked like it had been stored in someone's attic for decades. The brass hinges were tarnished with age, and the mahogany surface showed the wear patterns of something that had been handled frequently over many years. "Your father passed away 3 weeks ago," he said without preamble as he settled into the chair across from my desk. "Heart attack. He had left specific instructions that this box was to be delivered to you after his death, but only if you had demonstrated that you could build a successful life without his protection." The box contained 15 letters addressed to me in my father's careful handwriting, each envelope marked with a different year, spanning from 1998 to 2023. Alongside the letters were several cassette tapes labeled with dates and my name. I opened the earliest letter, first dated just 3 months after I had left home. "My dearest Elena," it began. "I am writing this letter knowing I will probably never have the courage to send it, but needing to document the truth about why I let you believe I was a coward who chose reputation over his daughter." The letter revealed a story I had never imagined. My father had discovered that my mother had been slowly poisoning my food with small amounts of household chemicals for months before the confrontation about the church money. He had found the bottles hidden in her sewing room, had seen the careful measurements she recorded in a notebook, had realized that my frequent stomach problems and fatigue hadn't been stress from college but deliberate harm. "Your mother was consumed with jealousy about your grandmother's obvious preference for you," the letter continued. "She had overheard your grandmother talking about changing her will to leave everything to you, and she couldn't bear the thought of Sarah being displaced as the family's primary heir." According to my father's account, my discovery of the church theft had provided the perfect cover for removing me from the house before my mother's poison campaign could escalate to something fatal. The staged intervention, the ultimatum, the exile had all been his desperate attempt to save my life without exposing my mother as attempted murderer. "I knew that if I accused her directly, she would deny everything and probably find a more effective way to harm you," he wrote. "Making you leave seemed like the only way to keep you safe while avoiding the scandal that would destroy Sarah's future and land your mother in prison." The later letters chronicled his efforts to support me from a distance. He had anonymously paid my tuition at Seattle Community College through a scholarship fund he had established. He had monitored my early business ventures through private investigators, ready to intervene if I faced financial ruin. He had even influenced James Chen's decision to invest in Phoenix by providing him with information about my character and work ethic. "Every success you achieved felt like a small redemption for what I had allowed to happen to you." One letter read, "I watched you build a life of integrity and purpose, and I knew that despite the terrible choice I had made, you had become exactly the woman your grandmother always believed you could be." The cassette tapes contained recordings he had made over the years, speaking to me as if I were in the room with him. His voice, aged and sometimes trembling, talked about his pride in my accomplishments, his regret about the silence between us, and his hope that someday I would understand why he had chosen to be hated rather than risk my destruction. The final letter, dated just 2 months before his death, contained a confession that broke my heart completely. The hardest part of watching you succeed has been knowing that you probably think I never loved you enough to fight for you. The truth is that I loved you too much to risk your mother finding another way to remove you from her path to your grandmother's inheritance. He chose to be hated rather than let her be destroyed, and she finally understood his silence. Understanding my father's true sacrifice fundamentally changed how I saw my own story. The pain of the past 27 years didn't disappear, but it transformed from a wound into something that could serve a greater purpose. I spent weeks processing his letters and recordings, and from that reflection came a decision to write one final letter, not to him, but to the 18-year-old version of myself who had left home with nothing but determination and heartbreak. The letter was published on my company blog under the title "A Message to My Younger Self," and became one of the most shared posts in Phoenix Financial's history. Dearest Elena at 18. It began. I know you're scared right now, convinced that being cast out means you're unworthy of love. But I need you to understand something that will save you years of trying to prove yourself to people who have already made their choice about your worth. The letter continued with the advice I wished someone had given me during those desperate early years in Seattle. Don't spend your energy trying to earn a seat at tables where you're not wanted. Don't shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold your dreams. Instead, build your own table. Make it big enough for everyone who has ever felt invisible, strong enough to hold the weight of their ambitions, and surround it with people who celebrate your success instead of resenting it. 2 months after that blog post went live, I received an invitation to speak at Columbia University's annual Women's Leadership Summit. The auditorium held 2,000 students, faculty, and community members, and I had been asked to address the theme of resilience in second act when life gives you a new beginning. Standing at that podium looking out at faces that represented every stage of the journey I had traveled, I spoke about the difference between surviving and thriving, between reacting to circumstances and actively shaping your future. I talked about the moment when external validation becomes less important than internal peace, and when you realize that the people who couldn't see your worth were never qualified to judge it in the first place. The kitchen table where I was seated at my sister's wedding became the most empowering place I've ever occupied. I told the audience, because it taught me that dignity isn't about where others place you, it's about how you choose to show up wherever you are. The response was overwhelming. 2,000 people rose to their feet in sustained applause that lasted 5 minutes. But more meaningful were the individual conversations afterward with students who shared their own stories of family rejection, career setbacks, and the courage required to start over. Among those who approached me was Linda Chen, a 58-year-old woman who had recently finalized her divorce after 30 years of marriage. She had spent 3 decades as a supportive spouse to a successful surgeon, raising their children and managing their social life, only to discover that her husband had been having affairs throughout their marriage and had hidden significant assets in offshore accounts. I feel like I'm starting from nothing at an age when most people are thinking about retirement, Linda told me after my presentation. I have an MBA I got before marriage but haven't used in decades, and I have an idea for a consulting firm that helps women navigate financial aspects of divorce. But I don't know if I'm brave enough to try. I agreed to mentor Linda through the Phoenix Second Chance Fund, and over the following months I watched her transform from someone who apologized for taking up space into a confident entrepreneur who launched divorce financial strategies within 6 months. Her firm became one of the most successful women-owned businesses to emerge from our program, helping hundreds of women protect their assets during marriage dissolution. Working with Linda reminded me why the Phoenix Fund mattered so much. We weren't just providing capital or business advice. We were showing women that their life experience was an asset, not a liability, and that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. She had become the voice she once desperately needed to hear. The invitation arrived on elegant ivory cardstock addressed in my Aunt Margaret's distinctive calligraphy. She had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over tensions and organized gatherings that brought together relatives who might otherwise avoid each other for years at a time. The Rodriguez family cordially invites you to join us for Thanksgiving dinner. The formal script read, Thursday, November 23rd at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Below the main invitation, she had handwritten a personal note. Elena, it has been far too long since we've all been together as a family. Your mother and I both hope you'll consider joining us for this special day. The fact that my mother's name didn't appear on the formal invitation but was mentioned in the personal note told me everything I needed to know about how this gathering had been orchestrated. My aunt had clearly served as the intermediary, probably spending weeks convincing my mother that extending this olive branch was the right thing to do while assuring other family members that my presence wouldn't create drama or uncomfortable moments. For 2 weeks, the invitation sat on my kitchen counter while I wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted to decline politely and continue living the peaceful, successful life I had built without the complications of family dynamics. I had finally reached a place where my past no longer defined my present, where I could think about my childhood without anger or sadness, where I felt complete without their approval or acknowledgement. But another part of me recognized that this might be my last opportunity for closure with the family that had shaped me for better and worse during my formative years. My father was gone, taking with him any chance of reconciliation or understanding. My relationship with my mother remained cordial but distant. Sarah had rebuilt her life after her divorce and seemed to be thriving in her medical practice, but we hadn't spoken directly since the wedding disaster. I called my mentor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, to discuss the decision. She had become someone I trusted for perspective on difficult personal choices, and her background in psychology gave her insights that pure business advisors couldn't provide. What do you hope to get from attending? She asked during our phone conversation. And what are you willing to risk by going? Those 2 questions helped clarify my thinking. I wasn't hoping to repair relationships that had been fundamentally damaged decades ago. I wasn't expecting apologies, explanations, or acknowledgments that would somehow retroactively heal old wounds. I was simply curious about who these people had become and whether I could sit in the same room with them as the person I had become without feeling diminished or defensive. The risk was relatively low. I was no longer the desperate young woman seeking validation from people who couldn't provide it. I had my own life, my own success, my own chosen family of colleagues and mentees who valued my contributions. If the gathering became uncomfortable or toxic, I could simply leave. I decided to attend, but with clear boundaries that would protect my well-being and allow me to maintain control over my own experience. I would drive myself, rather than accepting rides from family members, ensuring I could leave whenever I chose. I would limit my stay to 2 hours long enough to be polite, but not so long that old patterns of interaction could reassert themselves. Most importantly, I would not engage in discussions about the past, about missed opportunities for reconciliation, or about what our family relationships might look like going forward. This would be a present-moment interaction between adults who happen to share DNA and history, nothing more. I called Aunt Margaret to confirm my attendance and explain my conditions. She seemed relieved that I would be joining them and readily agreed to my boundaries, probably grateful that I was willing to participate at all. She would walk into that house one last time, but this time she held all the keys. Aunt Margaret's house looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, with the same faded wallpaper in the foyer and the familiar scent of cinnamon and vanilla that seemed to permeate every surface during the holidays. I arrived carrying a homemade pumpkin bread and a bottle of wine, prepared to fulfill my social obligations with grace and efficiency. My mother greeted me at the door with a hesitant embrace that felt more like a diplomatic gesture than genuine warmth, and I could see the relief in her eyes when I responded politely, without creating any immediate drama. The living room was filled with relatives I hadn't seen in decades, most of whom seemed genuinely pleased to see me, but uncertain about how to navigate the conversation given everything that had transpired over the past year. Elena, we've saved you a seat at the head of the table, Aunt Margaret announced, gesturing toward the formal dining room where an elaborate Thanksgiving spread was being finalized. Right next to your mother, where family should be. The offer was clearly meant as an honor, a symbolic gesture of welcome and reconciliation that would demonstrate to everyone present that I had been restored to my rightful place in the family hierarchy. But looking at that formal dining room with its carefully arranged place settings and hierarchical seating chart, I realized I had no interest in occupying any position that had been assigned to me by others. "Thank you, but I think I'll be more comfortable in the kitchen," I said with a warm smile that deflected any potential offense. I always did my best thinking in there anyway. I made my way to the kitchen where Maria Gonzalez was putting the finishing touches on side dishes and coordinating the timing of multiple courses. She had been working for Aunt Margaret for 20 years, and I remembered her from previous family gatherings as someone who managed the complex logistics of feeding 30 people with the quiet competence of a military strategist. "Mrs. Elena," she said with surprise as I entered her domain. "Are you sure you want to be back here with all the work mess?" "This is exactly where I want to be," I replied, rolling up my sleeves and asking what I could do to help. The kitchen is where the real magic happens. As we worked together preparing gravy and arranging serving platters, I learned that Maria had been sending money to her daughter in Guatemala for college tuition and had dreams of starting her own catering business once her family obligations were settled. I pulled out my business card and told her about the Phoenix Second Chance Fund, explaining that we provided both capital and mentoring for women exactly like her who had business experience but needed support to formalize it. "You've been running complex events for decades," I told her as we transferred stuffing to a serving bowl. "That's project management, logistics coordination, customer service, and quality control all rolled into one. You already have all the skills you need to run your own operation." Other relatives began drifting into the kitchen throughout the afternoon, drawn by the warmth and energy that naturally accumulated in the room where food was being prepared and real conversations were taking place. My cousin David asked about my company's expansion plans. My aunt's neighbor wanted advice about her daughter's student loans. 2 teenagers got caught up in a discussion about entrepreneurship and asked if they could intern with Phoenix Financial the following summer. "You know," I said to a small group that had gathered around the kitchen island while Maria and I plated desserts, "the best conversations always happen in kitchens. This is where real life happens, where people are themselves instead of performing for each other." By the time dinner was officially served in the formal dining room, I had connected with more family members in genuine ways than I had in all my previous years of attending obligatory gatherings. The kitchen had become the heart of the celebration, with people moving freely between the formal meal and the informal conversations happening around Maria's workspace. She had reclaimed the kitchen and transformed it from a place of shame into her throne room. As the afternoon wound down and relatives began organizing their departures, I stepped out into Aunt Margaret's backyard garden to get some fresh air and process the surprisingly positive experience of the past 2 hours. The November air was crisp, but not unpleasant, and I found myself standing near the oak tree where Sarah and I had once built elaborate fairy houses from fallen leaves and acorns. My mother appeared beside me a few minutes later, moving with the tentative steps of someone who had been gathering courage for this conversation throughout the entire gathering. She looked older than I remembered, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light, her face showing the accumulated weight of years spent carrying secrets and regrets. "I wanted to thank you for coming today," she said, simply standing beside me rather than facing me directly, "and for how gracefully you handled everything, especially in the kitchen." "You mean how I chose to sit in the kitchen?" I corrected gently. "It wasn't something that happened to me this time." She nodded, seeming to understand the distinction. "I watched you in there talking with Maria about her business dreams, connecting with the cousins, making everyone feel welcome. You turned it into exactly what you said it was, where real life happens." We stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, 2 women who had shared a complicated history, but no longer felt compelled to relitigate past grievances or negotiate future expectations. The dynamic between us had shifted from mother-daughter to something more neutral. 2 adults who happened to be related and were now attempting to find a way to coexist peacefully. "I know you received my letter," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. "I wasn't sure if you would read it or just throw it away." I read it, I replied. All 6 pages. I've been in therapy since your father died. She continued, apparently deciding that this conversation needed to include some level of honest disclosure. Trying to understand the choices I made, the fears that drove them, the ways I let jealousy and social pressure override my better judgment as a parent. I listened without commenting, allowing her to say whatever she felt needed to be said without encouraging or discouraging the direction of her reflection. The therapist helped me see that I was so afraid of losing our social position, of having people judge our family, that I convinced myself protecting our reputation was the same as protecting our children. But what I was really protecting was my own comfort, my own image of myself as a successful mother and community member. She talked for several minutes about the therapy process, about confronting the reality that her actions had been driven by fear and pride rather than love or wisdom. She acknowledged that learning about my father's true motivations had forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about that period of our lives. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, echoing the words from her written letter. "I don't even know what I'm hoping for from this conversation, except maybe the chance to tell you that I see who you've become, and I'm proud of the woman you are, even though I can't take any credit for it." When she finished speaking, I realized that something had fundamentally shifted in me during her monologue. The anger I had carried for so many years was simply gone, not because she had said the right words or offered adequate explanations, but because I no longer needed her acknowledgement to feel whole. "I forgive you," I said, turning to look at her directly for the first time during our conversation. "But I don't need you." The words weren't meant to be cruel, just honest. I had built a complete life without her input or approval, had found my own way to heal from the wounds of our shared past, had created meaningful relationships with people who valued my contributions rather than resenting my success. "I understand," she replied, and I could see that she genuinely did. "I hope someday that might change, but I understand." I walked back toward the house to say my goodbyes to the relatives who had made the afternoon unexpectedly pleasant, leaving my mother standing alone in the garden where we had finally found a way to speak to each other as adults, rather than as damaged parent and abandoned child. Some relationships don't end with fireworks, they fade into peace. 6 months after the Thanksgiving gathering, I received an invitation that filled me with genuine joy. Linda Chen, whose divorce consulting firm had become one of our most successful Phoenix Fund ventures, was getting married for the second time at age 60. The handwritten note that accompanied the formal invitation made me tear up in the best possible way. "Elena," she had written, "you taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Would you do me the honor of standing beside me as my maid of honor when I marry the love of my second act? You gave me the courage to believe I deserved happiness, and I can't imagine celebrating this moment without you there." The wedding was held at a vineyard in Sonoma County, an intimate celebration with 200 guests who represented the life Linda had built after leaving her first marriage. Unlike Sarah's elaborate display of social status, this ceremony felt authentic and personal, focused on the love between two people who had found each other after decades of learning who they really were. I stood beside Linda in a flowing lavender dress she had chosen specifically because she said it represented the way I had helped her see herself elegant, confident, and worthy of taking up space. Her groom Robert was a widower who had retired early from his engineering career to pursue photography, and the way he looked at Linda during their vows made it clear that he saw her as a complete person rather than a project to be managed. When the officiant invited me to speak during the ceremony, I found myself addressing not just Linda and Robert, but the assembled guests who represented every stage of life and second chances. "I want to talk about chosen family," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the vineyard. "The people we find who see us clearly, support us completely, and celebrate our growth rather than trying to keep us small." I spoke about Linda's courage in leaving a marriage that had diminished her, her determination to build a consulting practice that helped other women navigate similar transitions, and her willingness to open her heart to love again when it would have been safer to remain closed off. Linda taught me something important about timing. I continued looking out at faces that reflected decades of experience and wisdom. She showed me that there's no expiration date on dreams, no age limit on reinvention, no statute of limitations on happiness. At 60, she's not having a second wedding, she's having her first real marriage to someone who knows her worth. The response from the guests was immediate and emotional. I could see tears on faces throughout the audience, particularly among the women who had attended as Linda's clients, colleagues, and friends from her new life. These were women who understood the courage it took to start over, to believe you deserved better, to build something beautiful from the pieces of what hadn't worked. During the reception, I watched Linda dance with her new husband, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from being fully known and completely accepted. She had transformed from the uncertain woman who had approached me after my Columbia presentation into someone who moved through the world with quiet confidence and genuine joy. The photographer captured moments throughout the evening, Linda and me laughing during the bouquet toss, the two of us with arms around each other. During group photos, my speech that had moved the entire reception to sustained applause. In every image, I belonged completely, not as an afterthought or obligation, but as someone whose presence enhanced the celebration. This time, she belonged in every photo, every speech, every moment of joy. Linda's wedding had shown me what belonging felt like, but it was the invitation to deliver the keynote address at the National Women's Leadership Summit that confirmed how far I had traveled from that 18-year-old girl who had left home with nothing but determination. The summit, held in Chicago's McCormick Place, brought together 5,000 women from across the country, representing every industry and stage of career development. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience that filled the massive auditorium, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with having a platform. These women had paid registration fees, taken time off work, and traveled significant distances to hear speakers they hoped would provide insights that could transform their professional lives. "I want to tell you about a kitchen table," I began, and the audience immediately quieted, sensing that something meaningful was about to be shared. 2 years ago, my family seated me at a table in the kitchen during my sister's wedding, away from the important guests, hoping I would remain invisible during their celebration. I spoke for 30 minutes about the difference between being diminished by others and choosing to diminish yourself, about finding power in unexpected places, and about the moment when you realize that the opinions of people who don't value your contributions simply don't matter anymore. The kitchen table became my throne because I decided it was, I concluded. Power isn't about where others place you. It's about how you show up wherever you are. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, with women rising to their feet in waves as the applause built and sustained itself. But more meaningful than the applause were the conversations afterward, with attendees sharing their own stories of transformation and asking for specific advice about navigating career transitions and family dynamics. 3 months later, my memoir, From Kitchen to Corner Office, A Story of Resilience and Reinvention, was published by a major house that had been pursuing me since the viral wedding video first appeared. The book became a bestseller within its first month, but the real impact came from the responses I received from readers who saw their own struggles reflected in my journey. The passage about the wedding kitchen became a widely quoted social media phenomenon. They placed me in the kitchen thinking it would diminish me, not realizing that kitchens are where the most important work happens, where nourishment is created, where families truly gather. I didn't need their table, I built my own. But the most significant moment came during the book launch event in Sacramento, where I made an announcement that surprised everyone, including myself. After reading selections from several chapters and answering questions from the audience, I revealed a decision that had been months in the making. The Phoenix Second Chance Fund has grown beyond anything I imagined when we started, I told the packed auditorium. Tonight, I want to announce a new scholarship program that will provide full MBA funding to women in healthcare who want to develop business skills alongside their clinical expertise. I paused, looking out at the audience that included several family members who had driven down from Sacramento to attend the launch. The first recipient of this scholarship will be Dr. Sarah Rodriguez Miller, who has expressed interest in developing her own women's health consulting practice. The scholarship comes with one requirement: 200 hours of volunteer service with organizations that support women in transition. The audience erupted in applause, but I could see the shock on Sarah's face in the third row. After the event, she approached me with tears in her eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because breaking cycles requires someone to choose a different ending," I replied, "and because I have more than enough now to share." She chose mercy over revenge, and it made her more powerful than she'd ever imagined. 1 year after the scholarship announcement, I found myself sitting in my home office on a quiet Sunday evening, writing what I knew would be the final entry in the journal I had kept throughout this entire journey. The leather-bound book had chronicled my transformation from someone desperately seeking validation to someone who had learned to validate herself, and tonight felt like the natural conclusion to that narrative. I once fought for a seat at their table. I wrote in the careful script I had developed over decades of signing contracts and important documents. I begged to be included, apologized for taking up space, and measured my worth by their approval. Tonight, I understand that the real victory wasn't earning their acceptance. It was learning I didn't need it. Now I build tables where everyone belongs. The journal entry reflected on the project that had consumed the past 6 months, the Phoenix Cafe, a community restaurant and gathering space that would open its doors for the first time the following week. The space had been designed around a simple philosophy that emerged from my own experience of exclusion and belonging. Every table in the restaurant was round, eliminating head seats and hierarchical positioning. The menu offered sliding scale pricing, allowing women facing financial hardship to eat for free, while others paid what they could afford. Most importantly, every evening at 6 o'clock, one table was reserved for women who were eating alone, whether by choice or circumstance, ensuring that no one ever had to dine in isolation. The opening night celebration drew 50 women who had been part of the Phoenix ecosystem over the past 3 years, fund recipients who had built successful businesses, mentees who had found their professional voices, colleagues who had become chosen family. Linda Chen was there with her husband Robert, beaming as she showed off the consulting practice that now employed 12 people. Maria Gonzalez had closed her catering company for the evening to attend, bringing samples of the empanadas that had made her business one of the most sought-after caterers in Sacramento. Standing in the doorway of the restaurant, watching these remarkable women share stories and celebrate each other's successes, I felt a completeness that had nothing to do with traditional markers of achievement. This wasn't about profit margins or business expansion or public recognition. This was about creating something that mattered, something that addressed the fundamental human need to belong somewhere without conditions or qualifications. Sarah appeared beside me as the evening was winding down, having driven up from Sacramento to attend the opening. She had completed her first semester in the MBA program and was volunteering at a women's shelter as part of her scholarship requirements work that she admitted had changed her perspective on privilege and responsibility. "I never understood what you were building until tonight," she said quietly, watching the animated conversations happening around every table. "I thought success was about getting into the right spaces, impressing the right people, achieving the right milestones. But this is something else entirely. This is what happens when you stop trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for you," I replied, "and start creating spaces that reflect your values instead." As the last guests said their goodbyes and the staff began cleaning up for the evening, I walked through the empty restaurant, turning off lights and checking that everything was ready for our first official day of service. The silence felt peaceful rather than lonely, filled with the promise of all the conversations, connections, and moments of belonging that would happen in this space. She had built something beautiful from the ashes of rejection, a home where no one would ever eat alone. And that's the end of Elena's incredible journey from being the forgotten daughter relegated to a kitchen table to becoming the woman who built her own empire and chose mercy over revenge. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest power comes not from fighting for acceptance from those who don't value us, but from finding the courage to build something better for ourselves and others. Elena transformed her deepest wounds into her greatest strengths, turning a moment of family humiliation into a movement that helped thousands of women rebuild their lives. She learned that true belonging isn't about earning a seat at someone else's table, but about creating spaces where everyone can sit with dignity. What resonated most with you in Elena's story? Was it her decision to choose the kitchen table as her place of power, her journey of building Phoenix Financial from nothing, or perhaps her final act of extending grace to the family that had rejected her? I'd love to hear which part of her transformation inspired you most. If Elena's story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss stories of resilience and reinvention. These tales of women who refuse to let their circumstances define their futures need to be shared, and your subscription helps us reach others who might need to hear that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Leave a comment below, sharing your own thoughts about family dynamic second chances or moments when you had to choose between seeking approval and honoring your own worth. Your experiences might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded of their own power and potential, please share this video with them. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to build the life you deserve. Sometimes the best revenge is living so well that you no longer need revenge at all.